Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program is about to begin.
All right, everybody, please find your seats. Welcome back. Thank you. Welcome back to Personal Democracy Forum. We're heading into the morning stretch. Hope you all got your coffee and maybe something to nibble. As we always promise, people back in their seats at the beginning of a session, this is a chance to win another one of our wonderful prizes from one of our sponsors, Plectica. Which has given us a one-year subscription to their mind mapping tool. I'm going to toss this out, and I'm just going to have to say I can't aim in this direction. I'm really sorry because my mom is here, and you know the rules. So, all right. Sorry, Mom. Okay. So it's my privilege now to move us into a different part of the program. And introduce our next two speakers. And I just want to say, to frame where we're going now in the next series of talks. So this morning we stretched our imagination a little bit. We thought about the positive uses of imagination and imagining a future, better futures that we might want than the one that we have. But now we're going to talk about the one that we have and the challenges that we face at a moment when democracy is obviously in crisis and being challenged all over the world and here. And the fundamental problems that we're dealing with are things like a decline in trust across the board in so many institutions, the rise of inequality, of drastic inequality, that makes many people feel like the system is rigged, the system doesn't work, and it's just time to blow it up and throw it away. And the attraction to leaders who make promises that are kind of fantastical and impossible, but they sound and feel good. And that one of the ways these leaders succeed is by undermining, by not just gaming trust, as Jerry Michalski talked about at the opening yesterday, that they're using our sadly well-earned cynicism about our leaders against us. But it's also that they are now, what we're seeing is an acceleration of the breaking of the idea that we use facts to determine policy, and that we live based on past precedents, and that we have procedures for making decisions so that people can't just go willy-nilly and do whatever they want once they get elected into office. So this problem of how do we, hold on to the pieces of the system that actually do work to restrain authoritarians and keep democratic accountability working is the thing we're going to be talking about now in these next two talks. Now, our first speaker is no stranger to the PDF stage. She's been here before. Haley Van Dyke is the co-founder of the U.S. Digital Service. I think most people here probably know what the U.S. Digital Service is, but it is the premier organization at the federal level that works on basically modernizing how government services and technology use works, so that here we are 18 years into the 21st century, we start to get a government that actually is more effective at delivering on its promises. And we're really thrilled to have Haley back here at PDF, not only to give us an update on that critical work, but also to talk about how it plays into the crisis that we're in the middle of. So please welcome Haley Van Dyke.
Don't touch me. Good morning, everybody. I have to apologize in advance. I got a horrible cold yesterday, so you guys get me in this like lovely cocktail of like a NyQuil hangover and way too much caffeine that I'm on. So sorry about that in advance. But so anyway, okay, to start with a quick confessional for those of you who don't know me. Hi, my name is Haley. I'm a Democrat. I'm a progressive, which has been a little bit hard lately. I spent my career working on Democratic campaigns and politics and democratizing technology in a bunch of different facets. But last year, the most like insane thing imaginable happened to not only me, but to our country, as we all know. It happened to my life in particular, which was this lovely gentleman entered the scene. And not only did he happen to our country and to my life, but he happened to become my boss. And I was in an extraordinarily odd position, because I wasn't just a civil servant that happened to inherit him like the majority of the government. I actually ended up with the distinctly horrifying curse/honor of being the only Obama White House official who was asked to stay on in the Trump West Wing. Now, obviously, that doesn't seem like a hard thing to say no to. But I was in a little bit of a predicament. This was the predicament. I had just poured years of my life with many other people who are here in this room and all sorts of the community who helped to support this effort, building a young fledgling team that at the end of the Obama administration had just managed against all odds to actually become relatively successful. I feel very, very fortunate. It's like warms my heart in so many ways to be in an audience that is actually relatively familiar with USDS. But this was the team. So I won't go into too much detail on it. But for those of you who haven't heard of it or are not familiar with the way that we work, I'll give you a very quick overview. So the team is called the United States Digital Service. Our mission is to deliver better government services to the American people through technology and design, everything that this community knows and breathes and does very well every day. Our vision was that we were working to close the huge gap that had unfortunately started creating in our society between the quality of commercial services that we know and love and use every day and those that are often laggish and sluggish and horribly far behind provided from the government. The playbook that we were doing this to do this through is quite simple. It was recruiting the tippity-top of the folks from the private sector, bringing everybody like yourself, bringing them into government, where we paired them with top innovators inside government who actually knew how to get shit done and make things happen, and build small multidisciplinary teams with massive air cover from the president all the way on down, and drop them into the most critical transactional services that we had inside government. So things like veterans benefits, student loans, immigration, et cetera, with a massive mandate to go transform them for the better and actually close that gap and make them work. Now, this was an exceptionally hard undertaking. And when we started, we thought maybe we would be lucky to recruit like 10 people, maybe take on 2 to 3 projects over the rest of the administration. And much to our surprise, by the end of the first 2 years, we had recruited over 400 people, and we're taking over dozens of critical, mission-critical projects all across the government. As you can actually see from the last slide, one quick thing I was exceptionally proud of is that the team was over 50% women and exceptionally diverse, which is something that we care about. So just a quick piece of context, like one quick example of how the team works, then we'll move off it since I think most people here are familiar with it, but some context. So the United States government believe it or not, spends a lovely $86 billion annually every year on technology projects, on IT, which is mind-blowingly insane large number. This is more than all of Silicon Valley, if you were to wrap that into a bundle, spends on everything annually combined. Now, the real kicker here is there is a 94% failure rate of those projects. These are taxpayer dollars, right? Like, this is an epic crisis of delivery that we're living in the United States government. 40% of these projects never see the light of day, and 94% are over budget or are late. 40% never make it out of and into a place of production of any kind. It's a staggering, staggering crisis. So the theory of change USDS was working against was, if you actually study classic patterns of disruption, it was quite simple, right? You take something that has become routine and standard in one industry, and you apply it to another where it's a radical departure from the status quo. So think like Airbnb took stuff that was very normal from hospitality, applied it to our apartments, and like, boom, we're in a revolution. So that's what we did. We took very normal practices from the tech community, Agile, waterfall, moving things to the cloud, user-centered design, very, very simple things, not rocket science, and brought them into these institutions where they were new to help create the greatest amount of change for the greatest number of people possible. So one super fast example, which some of you might be familiar with, it's a tried and true example, but it's one of our favorites, immigration. So this is the classic immigration application. As you guessed it, it is almost 100% paper-based. They literally send files and boxes of papers from processing center to processing center, and when you add up the distance it travels, it goes around the globe almost 6 times. It's insane, super, super inefficient. Best case scenario, the application takes about 6 to 8 months to process for very simple things like even renewing your green card. So about a few years, actually nearly a decade ago, the government was like, cool, maybe we can do this better if it's online, and we should actually tap into the efficiencies of that. Let's give it a shot. The typical process began 6 years later, remember that 94% number, 6 years later, and $1.2 billion, like billion with a B, it failed to deliver a single piece of working code. And that was actually sadly very normal for how things go in government. That's the status quo. And at that point, the agency responsible, which is USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration, they could have done what also always happens, which is like, oh shoot, that contractor didn't work out. Let's go back to the drawing board and try this again. But instead they didn't. They were like, we need to think differently. We need to do this differently. And that's where they called us, the United States Digital Service, and our partners 18F and GSA. And we were able to come in, drop in, and start helping them. Within months of being on the ground, we were able to break up, we were able to start delivering the first product that ever been released on this, and in a very normal incremental fashion. We have now taken, the first product we worked on was the Form I-90. This is the paper-based form that should be very, very simple process-wise, because it's applying for your replacement green card. So we know you, we know who you are, and we just need to give you a new replacement card. This form, I'm now happy to say, is 100% online. You can actually apply for a replacement green card with nobody touching a piece of paper. It's faster, better for the employees who are doing their work, and also for the people who rely on these very, very important pieces of plastic that are your right to stay in this country, your right to work, et cetera. So we did this, again, like I said, by just breaking up these monolithic, waterfall, multi-year contracting processes and bringing in the normal parts of Silicon Valley way of working that we are all steeped in and know and love. And this might sound incredibly obvious, obviously, but this is not how government normally works. And we've continued in this agile fashion to release other products. This is a quick screenshot of MyUSCIS, which 18F helped us build to make this very complicated immigration process more human. We've released new payment systems, case activity statuses, and through each of these forms that we're releasing in the immigration thing, we're bringing them online one by one, and we're on track to be hitting an entire digitization of all of the immigration work soon. So there are dozens of projects like this happening across government. And as I mentioned, this is not actually rocket science, right? This is actually just really hard work and smart people showing up to try and make our country better and to try and help those who need our help the most. So anyway, back to the very, very tough decision that I was in the beginning of this, which is, what do I do? I'm a Democrat. I don't believe in anything that the president is doing or stands for, but we have this team who's extraordinary, actually starting to show results, and new, and is actually pretty much potentially on the chopping block. So I made the very, very hard decision in the heat of the 2016 election, where emotions were flying around, to stay and to do what I could to help protect the team. Despite the fact that it cost me a lot of family who stopped talking to me, a lot of friends who stopped talking to me. It was a very, very emotional decision for a lot of people, but for me, the decision was made. These results were, or this team was showing results. I believe that people needed it now more than ever. And if we believed the things that we had been saying over the last 2 years, that this work is actually about more than politics, it's about more than parties, it's about actually making our institutions and our government work for the people who need it most, then we had to stay. So I was armed with a very specific... It's very nice of you guys, thank you. So I had a very specific checklist of things that I was there to get done to secure the team. The second that checklist was completed, I put in my resignation the next day and left. But I'm extraordinarily excited to say that the team is still alive. It's going strong. It's 150 people strong right now. And best of all, the mandate has not changed one bit. We still have teams in the exact same places that they were working on before, on helping our veterans, on helping immigrants, on helping students. It's the same type of people doing the same type of work in the same model, which also relies in a shocking way on support from senior administration officials. But best of all, I was actually at the, I have left, as I said, I'm no longer there, but I was at the office the other day, and this little sign was in the window, which is hard to see, but it says, "Hate has no home here." So the culture also is alive and well at USDS, which is amazing. And not to mention, not only is the team still delivering great results and doing great work with a great culture, it's had some of our biggest wins yet. One of the small projects that has unfortunately plagued at least 3 administrations now, both Democrats and Republicans, has been getting the Department of Defense and the VA onto the same medical record system. This has been something that so many sessions of Congress have tried to solve, so many administrations have tried to solve, and this was one of the things that USDS was fortunately able to come in and help the beginning of the process to work. For those of you that don't know the story right now, literally they ship paper records, they drive them from the Pentagon over to the VA building and drop them off. That is like the majority of the record transfer system. It got so bad that a few years ago they literally paid to structurally reinforce the floors of the Department of Veterans Affairs because they were collapsing under the weight of the boxes of paper. So like, it's a problem. And while this work is definitely nowhere near done, I'm extraordinarily excited to say that for the first time in decades, movements are being made to get, contracts are in place to get both the DoD and the VA onto the same record system provider. But let's have a chat later about the health records ecosystem, because we need a lot of people to start companies in that space and help fix the competition there. But anyway, this is a huge, huge, huge accomplishment. One of the biggest things USDS has done, and it happened in the last few months. So, and what this sort of represents, honestly, is that like this is the watershed moment, right? Like this is where we have transcended politics. We have actually made it. We have survived. We are here to stay. We are getting support from Trump of all people. We were founded, obviously, by Obama, and this movement is taking off, which is fantastic. But so where does that leave us, right? Like this is definitely not the mission accomplished moment. I wish we could say that we were all done, cool, it's here, and we're ready to move on. But as every single person in this room who works on this stuff knows, we face existential threats every single day. And as I said before, I personally believe that this work has never mattered more than it does right now. Which is why, honestly, like we're at a bit of a moment of cultural reckoning. Another thing I don't need to explain to this community, and as Mika teed up in the beginning, we live and breathe it every day. But this moment is different. We are living through a very, very, very big moment, one that we need to inspect and reflect on very carefully. And I believe that what makes this moment different now is that this is not a war being waged at individuals or by individuals. We are living in the middle of a war that is being raised against our institutions and some of the most significant institutions in our culture. And this requires, honestly, a reevaluation of the strategies that our community is using to figure out how to get there. And I hate to say this part, but I think to many of us, and I actually got chastised for this in early 2016 as much as I did for my decision to stay, this was predictable. I called the Trump election. This was actually not hard to see if we pick our heads up and step back and look at the forest through the trees. But there are a few reasons, there's 2 big reasons I see behind the actual problem here that we all as a community need to start paying attention to. The first one is actually very well summarized in this disgusting chart. which is provided to us by the fake news site of the New York Times. But this is the this is the divide that's currently happening in America, where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. This is income disparity, and it's been underway for a long time. This is not new, but as we can see, we are in this extraordinary spread. And to be honest, for another moment of self-reflection, like, guys, this is us. Everybody in this room is on that upper right quadrant. Even me as a public servant on my 9+ years of a civil service salary, we're up there. And we need to be cognizant of that, and we need to be figuring out how we can use our skills as a community to start actually building solutions that address this problem. Because the reality is the upper right quadrant of that chart are these guys, right? And their teams are building what I like to call the servant as a service industry, right? We're continuing to remove every single inconvenience imaginable for ourselves, whether that's like someone can come literally into my house now to drop off my packages, like, okay, cool, or do my laundry, or like send a vegan hot meal to my doorstep, or whatever it is, buy my groceries for me. And on the second hand, like this move fast and break things culture of these companies is actually starting to do just that. It's starting to break our culture. And meanwhile, thank you. And meanwhile, the US government is also failing on two fronts. It's failing to step in and help solve this crisis and to regulate and protect our consumers. And it's failing to deliver on the core services themselves that actually help prevent this problem in the first place and help prevent that income disparity. The government is fundamentally failing to get people access to the services they want when they need it and how they need it. And this sharp contrast is creating the second factor of the crisis. Which is this other horribly ugly chart going the exact wrong direction, which is public trust in government. This is from a Pew study that's, This is from a Pew study. Where is that? Sorry, guys. This is from a Pew study that actually shows how sharp this decline has happened. And I believe that disparity gap of both our tools and how we build them and where our income sits in our communities is driving that. And honestly, like, our governments this is a deserved line. Our institutions deserve, this is accurately reflecting what our institutions are doing to deliver for our citizens. And the really scary part of this problem, though, is that when, as we all know, a pact between institutions and those they serve is broken, shit can get really weird really quickly. And this is not a sentiment confined to government. Our media is going through this, our tech industry is going through this, our institutions writ large are going through this. And they're being questioned and they're being under attack, and rightfully so. But the real questions we need to ask is, are our institutions, and is our country too big to fail? And quite sadly, I don't think so. We don't have to look that far back in our history, particularly European history, just several decades ago, to see what happens when we have a collapse of institutions. And we are dancing dangerously close to having all of those ingredients to make the same kind of cocktail right here. So don't get me wrong, they deserve to be criticized. We need to criticize them. We need to ask them to be better, but we cannot let them fail. We simply cannot. So what do we do? What do we do about it? Well, when I moved to DC almost a decade ago, I was talking with a dear friend of mine, Van Jones, who had about kind of some of the lessons that he had learned in community organizing, and he had an amazing anecdote, which I love. It was that he used to think of politics and his community organizing as a person walking on a tightrope. And he said he thought the entire goal of politics was to actually push the person to the left and push them off to the left of the tightrope, and then we win. And then he realized that actually that's not what the game is about. The game is moving the entire tightrope to the left. It's changing the entire conversation and the entire movement. And this is our moment right now to move the tightrope, to stop pushing each other and stop yelling at each other and pushing and trying to do this sort of agitation, but to actually just completely redefine how we're looking at these problems and how we're building solutions for them. But that requires some self-reflection, right? And I think the moment that we're at right now is needing to rethink a little bit of what the resistance looks like. Because the resistance can't just be a map of congressional districts that we must win or a single man that we need to get out of office, because that's not going to make all of these problems go away. Because this actually, as easy as it would be and as lovely as it would be to think that this is just about Trump, it's not. He's an easy villain to villainize, and I'm never going to defend him. But it's easy to miss the forest through the trees when we focus just on him. And now is not the time to turn our back on our institutions. Now is not the time to turn our back on those we distrust, Facebook, the media, et cetera. They need our help more now than ever because the people actually need our help more now than ever. This is not about blatant, thank you. You guys are kind. This is not as easy, again, as it would be to say this is about my racist aunt who lives in Wisconsin. It's not about blatant racism. This is about the system not working for everybody. And we need to fix it. We need to not forget these two charts, because this is what we need to be building for, and this is what we need to be working on. Excuse me, I'm sorry, my cold is like so bad. And part of what we need to do that is not actually to force people to care about electoral politics. It's actually to widen the tent of the resistance and to help get people engaged where they can and in ways they can to help this problem. And to be honest, I definitely don't have all the answers, but I believe in this community, and I believe that we can figure it out. And we can't let this movement that we've built, that is actually starting to work, suffer the same fate that election tech does, which is we focus on it every 4 years, and then we drop it in between in the off cycles, and we don't actually continue to build sustainable movements. So there are just a few. As one of my dear mentors, Todd Park, likes to say, we are in desperate need of a few brave men and women to come join the fight. We need people to serve. We need people to serve in places like the United States Digital Service and other teams. We need people to take this movement global and local. We need to go down into the states. We need to go into other countries. We need to go to the communities, and there's tons of great work happening in this space. This movement is here to stay. We need to start demanding elected officials bring this into their platforms that they're campaigning on, and they start asking for this change as well. But most importantly, and in some ways the hardest, we need more visionaries who are willing to continue to fight hard inside the belly of the beast, inside our institutions that are troubled, whether that's the media or inside tech or inside our political parties like the DNC. These are all in collapse. And we can't villainize people who are, let's criticize Facebook, please, we need to. But we can't villainize the people who are inside trying to create change. And we need more people to follow suit, because if we don't go into these places and start actually creating the change ourselves, it's not gonna happen. So please don't censor your criticism. We need it now more than ever. But let's hold each other up as a community and support each other as we fight this fight as change makers, as doers, as builders that are actually, I believe, we are capable of constructing a new world order that we want to live in. It's just time for a reframing. So to leave it, this is one of my favorite things from the Obama Oval Office. He had a little plaque on his desk which was there every single day. I always, the red button is very ominous underneath it. But, but it said, hard things are hard. No, it's a tiny red button, right? I wonder if Trump's fingers can even fit in it. Sorry. Anyway, but the point is, hard things are hard, right? And this is going to be hard. But we need to do this now. We have no other option, because we cannot fail at this. And the question is no longer, can we do this? We have the playbooks, we have the people, we have the talent, we have the brain share. The question is, will we do it, and will you? Thank you. Thank you.
Come sit with me for a second.
Right.
Thank you.
Sorry for dealing with my voice.
You sit here. You sit here. So we only have a few minutes for Q&A. We definitely want to get to one or two of the audience's questions. But thank you for that fantastic talk. So very quickly, if you could maybe address how does inside the digital service, how do the sorts of questions that Natalie Harris was bringing up earlier this morning about ethical issues that arise, how does that get dealt with? I mean, and I know this may be sensitive to talk about publicly, but has the USDS ever needed to push back against some kind of unethical use of tech? We know that there's probably somebody at Palantir with a contract to figure out how to use machine learning to identify undocumented people living in the United States. So there are definitely other ways to use technology in service of other government goals, right? So talk about the ethics of this.
Yeah, and it's obviously a very hard nut to crack that we're not facing only in government at places like USDS, but also Facebook, Twitter, name your tech company. But the way at least I approached that problem, and I'll be honest, we had moments of ethical questioning that came up in both administrations. And a lot of that is due to a lack of understanding of how to use technology and not understanding the implications of it all of the way. So in my opinion, the only way to fix that problem and to make sure the right ethical decisions are made is getting people who understand the technology into the room at the decision-making table, because that's how you prevent bad decisions from getting made. But the problem is you can't do it if you're not there. And a lot of people were like, oh, I'm going to stay in the administration and I'm going to wait until that line gets crossed and then I'm going to quit. For me, the line was crossed before he even entered the Oval Office. Like that line was so far back there. It wasn't about that for me. It was about being able to go in and actually help create those firewalls against the bad things happening.
So question, let's go back to the failure rate of those expensive government IT projects. And I always ask this, which is, why don't we hear more about how much is actually being saved by, I think people would be amazed if they knew that billions of dollars were actually being converted back to, back into the general treasury because of, so why don't we hear more about this?
I think that hits on like two very big things, cultural problems in DC. But one of the dreams I wish would come true one day is if there was like a bounty of some kind for public servants, where if you saved a ton of money, you got to keep like 0.01% of that, which would have made like the quote unquote like stock value of every USDS employee like, But I think that this actually hits on the biggest cultural problem that is one of the core roots, as I see it, of the issues in DC, which is there is a very severe culture of I almost use a Trump word, of just criticism and persecution when things go wrong. The number one thing you hear walking around any federal agency is like, oh, don't be the first one to try something, because if you're the first one to try it and it goes wrong, you're going to have your ass hauled up to Congress and you're going to be testifying and you're going to get fired and you're going to be on the front page of the Washington Post. Like congressional testimonies and front page of the Washington Post are like the two, like, oh God, you don't want to do that. And it creates this extraordinarily risk-averse culture. And it means that no one wants to stick their neck out and be the first one to change. But when you have teams like 18F and USDS come in, show that things can be done differently, it just opens the floodgates, because people are like, oh, cool, we're not the first ones, so we can go and do this now too. So we actually thought of USDS in many ways as simply a vehicle to outsource risk, so that way we could kind of break that cycle of fear. Because we're like, if it goes great, take the credit. If it goes wrong, blame it on us. But I think that we do need to see more attention paid to the successes that are coming out. We need to celebrate civil servants for being, for taking risks, for trying things new, and for trying to do things differently, and shift the paradigm from being like taking risk and failing is bad to the status quo is failure and we need to change it. And that is, I think, a shift that we need to do in coordination with media and Congress and this community.
Last very quick question at the top there. So who is involved in the digital service movement, and why should people of color and women cooperate with it?
That's like a very great question, but also hard to answer, because it's like stating that the sky is blue. Like, diverse teams, as we all know, create better outcomes, and that is just like a simple fact. So, but it's something that was very important to us at USDS. It was a hilarious battle of lawyers, and just like where government just gets itself wrapped around the axle so many times. We wanted to come out and say that we had a goal of recruiting a team that represented the demographics of the United States of America, because we wanted to be the people that we were building tools for, so we didn't have the problem of Facebook and all of your huge giant tech companies that are a bunch of rich white dudes building tools for a bunch of other rich white dudes. Like, we wanted to actually have that representation in our team. But unfortunately, because of various quota laws and things, we weren't actually able to come out and say that goal. So anyway, it was not a formal goal that we had, but we crushed in tech industry benchmarks in terms of diversity and women on our team. Absolutely crushed it. and did that through an amazing team of recruiters. Jennifer Anastasoff was our head recruiter, and she worked her tail off to actually try new recruiting strategies, to reach out of the tent, to not go to the same wells that everyone goes to for tech talent, but actually bring more folks and widen the tent and broaden this movement.
Yeah, and your success at doing that, I think, will be paying dividends for years as the people who do the service for a while, then go out and do other things. There's so much leadership that's being generated from that. It's amazing. So thank you so much. We are out of time, but you're going to be doing a workshop this afternoon, going deeper into all of this. We could get that slide up so people know where to go. But thank you again, Haley.
Yeah,
thanks for coming back and speaking even with a cold.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, don't hesitate. Thank you.
So that'll be in room W401. This afternoon at 2:30. Okay, so our next speaker, and in the same theme here of democracy in crisis, what do we do? Our next speaker, Anna Galland, comes to us as the executive director of Move On Civic Action. And I have to say, I have been both a critic and a fan of Move On for a very long time, because it's sort of the mothership of online organizing. Believe it or not, Move On is 20 years old. It's not even a teenager anymore. And Anna has been helping run the organization for the last several years. And we invited her here to speak this year because Move On has emerged in a moment of mass participation. This is a time where millions of people are awakened to the challenges that we're facing and are getting themselves involved at the local level in a way that I can't remember in a very long time. And so it's in a very interesting place, Move On, to be an organization that has something like 8 million members online, but also now very engaged in this flowering of organizing that's happening in communities all over the United States. So when I asked Anna if she would come speak, I said to her, you really have to address this question of how, in a moment where so many people want to move, where does a big organization that has for a long time operated in the sort of digital arena figure out how to sort of push power, share shareability down into the local level? So she's going to talk about that, and then we'll certainly get into it as well in the workshop this afternoon. Anna Galland.
Yeah, we're not a spring chicken anymore. We're sort of like finding ourselves at the end of college mode, I guess, or not college. So hi, you can learn a lot about yourself and about your community in a time of crisis. I have three kids now. When I gave birth to my twin girls in 2011, I had a pretty rough multi-month recovery period. And in that time, our friends around our city and around the country stepped up in profound, often hilarious and inspiring ways that really helped us get through. One friend who was a vegetarian cooked meals for us, taught themselves to cook meat and made dinner for us every other night for 3 months. Another friend gave up her house so that my mother and mother-in-law could be nearby to help us get through. And I think if you think about your own life and think about various kinds of crises you've come through, you'll remember moments in which your community totally inspired and surprised you by how it showed up and how it stepped up. That's when we learn what our communities are capable of, is through times of crisis. And friends, we are in a crisis. Collectively, our democracy is in a state of acute crisis. To be real clear, we've been in a state of crisis for a long time. We've been in a state of underlying chronic and interlocking crises, ranging from big money distorting our politics to the kind of tenacious grip of racism in America. And that actually, those crises paved the way, I think, to the point of our last speaker, for the state of acute crisis of Trump and Trumpism. Actually, here's the alternate title I had for my talk today. Point being, it took a lot for us to get into this total mess, and there's no one simple silver bullet, no tech tool, no artificial intelligence solution, no single 2020 candidate that's going to be able to get us out of it. We together face a massive organizing challenge. That's our project right now. And I really believe that the next 6 months, including the hugely important midterm elections, are our single best opportunity that we're going to get as a democracy to decisively interrupt the accelerating multi-front crisis that we're caught in. We need to interrupt not only the current attacks on our communities, we need to stave off a full-blown descent into authoritarianism, and we need to make a real leap forward into fully inhabiting the dream of this democracy, the dream that we've never yet lived into but will. So I'm real confident that we're going to rise to the challenge, actually. I spend every single day reading the darkest headlines imaginable with many of us, if you've stayed tuned in to your news feed. And I'm feeling optimistic. I think the vast public is very clearly not on the side of the would-be autocrats that are currently running the country. And I see us learning in real time right now about how to show up in powerful new ways. Through this crisis, I see us building for the longer-term transformation and reinvigoration of this democracy. So, in this time of crisis, we are learning what we are capable of, and we are learning and modeling, I think, some inspiring new practices of resistance and resilience that will move us forward. So let's talk about what that is. This is really the core of my thing I want to be in conversation with you here about. We are learning through this crisis that we need civic resistance, and we need what I would call small d democratic, yes, we're progressive, but small d, democratic resilience to meet this moment. Resistance and resilience. That is modes of resistance that build the power of organizing and community institutions, and resilience that sustains us through the inevitable challenges and setbacks because we are smartly networked, we've distributed power across many nodes, and because we're in genuine human relationship with each other. So as I talk about this to sort of ground in the organizational context I come from, and there's some amazing MoveOn staff here that you should connect with while you're in this space. MoveOn is proudly progressive. Our vision is to build a country and a world where everyone can thrive, one that's marked by equality, sustainability, justice, and love. We believe that economic justice and racial justice and other forms of social justice are mutually reinforcing and not contradictory, which is an important, I think, ideological place to hold in this moment. We try to do two things very well. We fight for diplomacy as we fight for things like diplomacy with Iran, or extending healthcare access to millions of Americans, or passing the DREAM Act, or in this moment, defending investigations into Trump and his campaign. We organize, we build leadership at the grassroots level, and we mobilize. We pick specific moments and campaigns, and we focus our broad network on taking action together. And we use technology to accelerate both of those strategies. So that's our context. How do we resist, and what are we learning about what works in resisting? Sustained civic resistance is essential to get us through the vicious attacks and state of acute crisis that we are in. So that might sound obvious. There's been a lot of talk about the resistance for the last 18 months, but I've also sometimes sensed this almost wistful hope that, for example, the courts could just step in as the adult in the room and save us. If you've ever sensed that, right? Of course, the courts have a key role to play, but the courts are not our savior here. The courts can be, and already are being in front of our eyes, like while we're in this room, politicized. They will be politicized over time. And other institutions are not stopping the madness that we are caught in. Remember when people thought that the Republican Party would stop Trump? Yeah, that didn't happen. We need many strategies in the age of Trump and Trumpism: legal, cultural, corporate, narrative, certainly electoral. But I want to be real clear that the rest of our strategies won't work. They won't stick if we aren't deeply invested in organizing people in communities. We need to be invested specifically in nationally networked organizing that is connected to authentic, diverse, local leadership and grounded in healthy institutions that weave us together in working for justice and dignity for everyone. That's the civic part of civic resistance. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about institutions in a bit, but institutions are real important in this crisis. So I see 4 key qualities that we need our resistance organizing to have. First, it must be leaderful. So we need to be very serious about supporting multiracial, multi-generational, locally rooted individuals and groups of leaders. there's a Move On member whose name is Lynn Hughes, who's based in Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania. She held a house party in January 2017. And I love what she told the local paper later, which was, I figured, I have a house, I'll have a party. House party. And she expected 5 people, 25 people showed up. They used the materials and the calls to action from national networks like Move On, like Indivisible. They organized, they built local leadership, they organized through the kind of flashpoint moments, the big headline moments, and the quieter stretches too. And they formed an organization called Mount Lebanon Rise Up. And a year after that first house party, I have a house, I'll have a party, they helped play an essential role in electing Connor Lamb to the House of Representatives in the special election that happened in their area. There are so many people around the country who are like Lynn, who are ready to step up and are stepping up in these inspiring ways and will keep doing so if they're properly supported. We also need organizing which is truly scaled and networked on a national level and deeply localized and personalized. So in the fight to defend the Affordable Care Act last year, we saw unbelievable scale. So Move On members alone made over 1 million phone calls to Congress and other targets to defend healthcare access. And with our partners, we helped bring hundreds of thousands of people to town halls around the country. And so much of that work was also deeply localized and personalized. So there was the woman who stopped Susan Collins at a 4th of July parade in Eastport, Maine, and forced her to look in the eyes of her daughter with cystic fibrosis and said, this is who you need to be voting for. Because we went so deep locally and because we were so excellently networked nationally and strategic nationally, we were powerful enough to do the impossible, which was to defeat what was Trump's stated top priority, the thing he was going to achieve on day one of taking office. We can be that powerful. Third, powerful civic resistance needs to be fundamentally connected to institutions and to our core values reinforced through those institutions. So we need, it might seem a little, not ironic, but a little odd to say that to disrupt power, we need powerful institutions, but it's absolutely true. In part because I think there's this conceptual mistake that happens in this kind of acute era where people think that the iconic mobilizations of the resistance era just kind of happen. Maybe the internet did it, or maybe it was some resistance fairy. Friends, there is no resistance fairy. There is only us. We're it. There's us and there's our institutions. And so, for example, with the Muslim ban airport protests, which folks may remember, including the spark for the wave across the country, which began here at JFK Airport, those protests, which were so beautiful, so inspiring, so important for setting the tone of this new era we were entering, were profoundly enabled by groups including the New York Immigration Coalition and Make the Road New York and the Arab American Association of New York and elected officials like Jerry Nadler, who rushed, I believe he was the first or one of the first elected officials to rush to the airport at JFK at the moment that the protests first sparked. So we know, and I should say also that many of the organizations and institutions that stepped up and enabled that moment had themselves Muslims in positions of leadership, and so therefore were able to take the lead quickly and appropriately, right? So we know that community organizations and institutions are essential in producing those moments, but they're also essential to make use of what comes out of them, to make the most of those moments when they occur. So I really love Zeynak Tufekci, who's spoken in this space in the past. I love her point that protests are just a signal of our underlying potential power and not the power itself, right? So for the power itself, you gotta build and sustain excellent institutions. That's part of the equation. So I joined my local church in Evanston, Illinois, where I live, after Trump was elected, because I think that's true even on the hyper-local level. And I've been so proud to see our church offer sanctuary to a woman who would be murdered or could be murdered if she was deported back to El Salvador. Our democracy, our communities, our movements need healthy organizing and community institutions at every level, local, regional, and national, to survive this era, to thrive, and to win. Finally, our civic resistance must be built on humility and openness and real trust in grassroots voices. So we need to be listening to, not just listening to, but elevating, centering, giving power to the folks who have a better idea of what we should do or a better way of saying what needs to be said than the ostensible professionals. So our systems and plans need to be able to hear and capture and adapt to what's bubbling up. So one example, MoveOn's Political Action Committee is running a video persuasion program where our members record themselves talking about why they're voting the way they're voting. And we then use careful analytics to find persuasion effects and identify the people who will be persuaded by each video. I've been so happily inspired and blown away by some of the pairings that we are finding. So the older white man in Pennsylvania who turns out to be persuasive to conservative young white fathers when he's talking about the government that his children will inherit. Or the middle-aged black MoveOn member mom in Virginia who was persuasive to conservative rural white women in talking about caring about her family's safety in the aftermath of Nazis marching in Charlottesville. So none of those messages would have been scripted by a professional consultant in DC. The way they said it, the people that they turned out to connect with, and that's precisely the point, right? So authenticity travels. We kind of know this intuitively in the age we're living in, but there's also this ocean of creativity and ingenuity and heart in the grassroots of this democracy. And we need smart resistance organizing structures that will allow that brilliance to bubble up and find a home. When you break it down like that, it sounds pretty simple. We're just going to resist in a way that's leaderful. We're going to be rooted locally and networked nationally. We're going to be grounded in institutions. We're going to be fundamentally grassroots. But we know things aren't always smooth, and we know this work is going to be it's going to take a while. Remember that first slide of all the things I think we basically need to do, my alternate talk? So while we are resisting the acute attacks we face today, we also need to be building our resilience on every level, from the individual to the movement level. So what do we mean by that? We need to be able to collectively bounce back and reroute at a movement level when we come through terrible defeats, which we will and we already have. We need to be building human relationship and mutuality and webs of real shared power and accountability, including preparing for the worst in a way that builds our power, even if the worst doesn't happen. Feels hard to say that. Sometimes it feels like the worst is happening every day, but a new worst. So the Trump is not above the law network is a really interesting case in point about this. So MoveOn and a number of partners helped to build this rapid response network defending the Mueller investigation. 400,000 people have signed up, have affirmatively come to the site and signed up to attend one of 800 local volunteer-led events in case the independent investigations into Trump are ever hobbled. And the interesting thing is, but that's amazing. I know that we will be there on the day after any such triggering event happens. Let's hope it never happens. But the really interesting thing is that the organizing of that network has expanded and strengthened our coalitions nationally and locally. People will say, you'll see sort of coming into the organizers working on this network, people saying, I don't agree with MoveOn on anything else, but if that guy's fired, I'll be there the next day. So we've seen that we've developed and supported local leaders who are now doing proactive work on a range of fronts. It's like our emergency prep work has built our small d democratic muscle, if that makes sense. Okay, so 2, to achieve resilience, we need to share power and resources while working hard to maintain smart alignment and coordination. So the great civil rights hero Bayard Rustin has this quote that I've returned to at various points, that if we desire a society which is democratic, democracy must be a means as well as an end. I take that as a really useful challenge. It's a useful provocation. That we have to have institutions and movements which are profoundly representative and also accountable. So among other things, let's move real resources. So when MoveOn had a spike in small donor fundraising in 2017, we directly granted or bundled over $5 million to other organizations in the resistance. We're not a foundation. right? Yeah, it was awesome. We were very proud of it. We're not a foundation, but if we can do that, others can too. We believe that we have to be building others up, not just those inside our narrow institutional walls. We're more resilient collectively if we are all strong and healthy across organizations. So third, we're going to need a variety of models, from radically decentralized to more tightly directed. So the Movement for Black Lives' network explicitly doesn't require ideological, policy, or strategic agreement across chapters. The organization, or the network Cosecha, runs this decentralized network of leaders who operate independently. People's Action, a community organizing network, has state affiliates that federate with the national network. And there's many other models that are more or less decentralized. I would argue that all have their role to play in helping us survive and get through this era. Finally, to build and sustain our democratic resilience through this time of acute crisis, let's learn from what's working and do more of it. And let's learn from what's not working and do less of it. Sounds simple, but it's kind of hard, turns out. So here's something that has worked in the last 18 months in organizing effective resistance. Giving people an adaptable, replicable, clear container for action, and asking a lot of them and empowering them to run with it and adapt it as useful in that community context. The Working Families Party helped to kickstart something called Resist Trump Tuesdays, which was Resist Trump Tuesdays means on Tuesdays, you resist Trump. You show up at your local congressional office and you hold a protest. There are places where those Resist Trump Tuesday events are still going 18 months later, and they've literally turned into a platform for local connection and planning and action. So that's something that's worked. Let's adapt when things are not working. Here's an example of that. In the 6 weeks from roughly mid-April to the end of May, MoveOn saw a significant dip in response rates across a number of channels where we do our organizing. And we realized what was happening, which was people needed a change of pace from the daily drumbeat of outrage, right? We need to remember that no one can sustain outrage all the time, even when everything is outrageous. You cannot live in outrage day in and day out. So here's what worked. We actually had to change gear and find ways for our members to connect in ways which were also joyful. Offering free ice cream did not hurt either. So that's what we need for resilience. We're going to plan and prepare in a way that builds our power, even if the new worst doesn't come to pass. We're going to share resources. We're going to embrace the practice of democracy wherever we can. We're going to use a variety of models, and we're going to learn and iterate based on what's actually working. So I'm going to close with a reminder of who is showing up in those inspiring ways that will help us get through. Who's actually modeling resistance and resilience in this acute time? People like Haniza, who we're going to hear from now.
What motivated me to start organizing is my experience as an undocumented immigrant. I know how it feels to be silenced, discriminated, and basically have your rights taken away from you. So when I got my citizenship last year, I made it my immediate goal to make sure that I use my new rights and privileges as an American to fight for a much more progressive nation. We have, as Americans, a great privilege to help everybody out as long as we use it and work together towards a common goal.
So there are millions of people around the country like Haniza in the broad sense, MoveOn members as well as members of many of our peer organizations like the ACLU and Color of Change and many others, who are the folks who are showing up in those inspiring ways that we need in this context of crisis, who have the power to save us from our current predicament if we support them in the ways that they deserve and need. We'll be talking here at PDF this afternoon in a workshop called Local Organizing in the Age of Mass Participation with some incredible organizers from around the country and strategists about how to extend the grassroots energy that we have seen and how to build our resilience as we do. Hope you'll join us. And just to close us, we are learning so much in this time of crisis collectively. And I'm finding real inspiration in people like Haniza and others who are stepping forward for the first time. We're learning that now more than ever, motivated Americans of all walks of life at a mass scale, people and networks and institutions who care about preserving the equal application of the rule of law, who care about preserving and protecting our communities that are under attack, who want to work for freedom for all, who are committed to building a system that's not rigged for the few but works for the many. People are stepping up. We can support them. Civic resistance is what's going to blunt the scariest attacks of today, and democratic resilience is what's going to help us sustain this work and deepen it for the long haul to turn our country towards justice and dignity for all. Thanks.
Quick seat. So we'll get the questions up from Slido. People put in your questions, but I'm going to ask you one that may surprise you. But I'm wondering if there's anything you think we, and now I'm going to say we as in the sort of New York, we're very much a New York crowd here. We are Eastern Seaboard elite. Anything we should be doing less of because some of the polarization in this country is built by elites misbehaving too. And that I think it's fair to say, and this goes back to Haley's talk, you know, when she pointed out that upper edge of the inequality chart, that the one thing I didn't hear in your talk is, you know, what's our responsibility for this mess as well? And not just how great we are, how we're going to defeat all the bad stuff. How do we contribute to the bad stuff that we should do less of?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of pieces of answering that. I think one way I would suggest is by not giving up on anyone and taking responsibility for everyone. By which I mean the racist aunt in Wisconsin who was mentioned. We got to not give up on her. That's actually, especially if you're white, that's our responsibility.
Right, so the question I see a question that came up and a lot of people voted up is whether Move On is itself contributing to polarization or can it be a depolarizing force? I remember very early in Move On's history when Wes and Joan were running it, there was this effort to connect people, you know, to sort of figure out how you could get someone from Blue America on the phone with someone from Red America and just talk. Yeah. So how do you respond to that? I think there are people, and maybe some in this room, who think Move On actually contributes to polarization.
So one thing that I think is important for us to keep in mind is that sometimes people say we need a Tea Party on the left. And I think there is a way to argue that that would be useful. I also think it's important for us to recognize we're in a moment where there is a vast majoritarian movement that is not in control of the levers of government. And building power for that vast majoritarian movement, rather than thinking we need some fringe perspective, I think is an important place to stay grounded in. And then I think the kind of, when people talk about polarization, I think it's been so important to remember and to look back to the research by political scientists who've shown we're seeing not just polarization, but asymmetric polarization, right? The right has gone wildly off the deep end into white supremacist marches in places like Charlottesville and elsewhere. And the left is like, maybe we should have healthcare for everyone still, maybe? Like those are not, there's a false equivalence challenge that we have to avoid falling into, I think. Yeah.
Okay. One more that we have time for. This is more of an internal question, but a good accountability question for the executive director of Move On, which is how does Move On's own legal governance structure actually and accountably share power with local networks and the people that it promotes? How does that work?
Yeah, so we do not have a voting-based structure. A lot of unions and other organizations have gone deep into democratic modes of electing leaders, and we know that that's not a silver bullet either to make an institution healthy or successful, but it can be something to play with. We've not gone that route. One thing we did do is set up an open petition platform in an effort to push out access to one of our main resources, which is our email list. So folks may not know this, but every week for our community of millions of people, an equivalent of 1 or 1.5 full base messages goes out, not from Move On's staff, but from partner organizations, often local groups, individual activists who have built themselves a chunk of our list that they're able to just talk to all they want. So we've tried different organizing strategies to push the power to access our resources out. And of course, the kind of we will only be as healthy as we are effective at listening to, understanding the actual organizing needs of, and serving not just our members, but the broad progressive and broad, I think in this moment, to my point of my talk, civic movement in this country.
So just to clarify, Move On has a board? Move On Civic Action?
We have a tiny little board. It's got some wonderful people that you probably know on it, Ai-jen Poo, James Rucker, some other folks. We have a tiny little board, and mostly the staff is empowered to organize the members.
Yeah. Great. Well, really great to have you here, Anna. Looking forward to your afternoon workshop. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll join her in room 220 in the afternoon. I'd like to bring my colleague Danielle Thompson up to introduce the next group of speakers.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to change gears a little bit here and think about some of the most vulnerable communities who are experiencing not the good of technology and the how we make good, but maybe some of the more insidious or complete being forgotten of in those contexts of technology. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about communities of color who are policed by Palantir, maybe without knowing about it, or smart cities themselves. I'm talking about folks who, after a disaster situation, have no access to technology or communication tools, and is it because of the color of their skin down in Puerto Rico? So as we go into the next two topics, I urge you to think about these two issues very critically. How do we make good tech for those communities of color, and how do we get it to them in ways that they want it for themselves? So for the next talk, our next speaker, Matt Mitchell, to me sort of comes off as an international man of mystery. He's an expert in digital security, particularly for vulnerable communities. And I know many folks in this room have oftentimes called him, and if you haven't, should call him to employ his services. I think of him as a sort of digital Robin Hood, taking those tech tools and empowering folks to stare back at the people who are staring at them and to protect themselves. So, as many of us in this room who work in smart cities think of them as liberating or life-changing, life-enhancing innovations, sometimes folks in vulnerable communities don't see them as so smart, but rather menacing. So with that, I would like to invite Matt Mitchell to the stage.
Hey, everybody. Yo. POC. Can I hear you? Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, we got to get that. Somehow we got to get there. Right. Okay. We can do it, progressives. Okay. All right. So my talk is Smart City versus Menacing City, a Wakanda deferred. So let me break that down. All right. So welcome. I'm Matt. I'm the director of digital safety and privacy at a group called Tactical Technology Collective, which is an NGO based in Berlin. But I also have this thing called Crypto Harlem that I do here in New York City. So let's talk about this whole menacing city thing. So I was at this NetGain Internet of Things conference, Internet of Things, and Darren Walker from Ford said, if you care about cities, you can't simply think the smart city movement is necessarily a good thing. It's a smart cities movement, but it's also a menacing cities movement. If you don't understand the potential of smart cities to become menacing cities, then you don't understand the intersection of urban development and social justice. And it's at those intersections that the real change in the world and the real threats to our fundamental rights and the things that all these foundations like Ford, et cetera, care about, at those intersections are these dystopian and potentially bad things can happen. So this is a talk about bad things, but by good intended people, right? So Langston Hughes quote, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? I know many of you know this one, okay? And then Octavia Butler, sci-fi. I'm a big nerd, I love sci-fi. And in her book, Parable of the Sower, which came out like in the 90s, like 93 or something, she talks about way into the future, 2020, which is like almost here now, right? In a world where people live in these like gated communities where they can have some semblance of a normal life. You know, you can have a garden, children can play, and it's only a few chapters in that you realize what's going on outside those walls. all chaos is reigning, and it's really like hell on earth. And that, to me, is basically smart cities defined, strangely enough. Cool. So this is Jacob Lawrence. Has this great migration piece of lot of artwork really capturing the black experience. So many black folks escaped slavery and uncertainty for a better life up north. What does that look like? And that's why so many black folks live in cities. So when we talk about cities, we're really talking about black folks and hopes and dreams. And then, of course, not a real city. I know a lot of kids will be upset about that. But as a comic book nerd, I used to read about this thing called Wakanda, and it was like an African nation that was super high tech. I never dreamed it'd be a movie that I would see like way too many times. But there it goes, you know? So shout outs to the black sci-fi people, like my friend Deji, okay? So this is just a boring slide about me. I'm a hacker, and I know what I'm talking about. That's the next slide. Okay. So yeah, that's okay. We can laugh. We're cool. All right. So this is the future that we were told, you know, this Star Trek future, where we had Russia and the United States together. Little did we know that'd be happening right now, right? But we had black folks, Asian folks, aliens, like aliens, yeah, you know, like everybody together, right? And yeah, that's the future that we were promised in like 1968. Okay, that's not a video that I'm not gonna play. It's nothing we're not gonna play. But now we go to kind of the now. My buddy Jackie, he's a tech nerd too, an amazing developer, and he lives used to live out here in New York. Now he's in Silicon Valley. And you know, he uses everything as soon as it comes out, bleeding edge technologist. And he uses Google Photos as soon as it came out, and it went through all of his photos and categorized everything. These are Jackie's pictures of skyscrapers. These are Jackie's pictures of cars. But Google Photos said these are Jackie's pictures of gorillas and categorized all of Jackie's friends. And on Twitter, he was outraged, and quickly Google staff came involved and got in that thread and like, is this true? Can you give us the logs? He had all the data. It really did happen. But how does stuff like this happen? I mean, this isn't beta. This wasn't like a, you know, tested by a friend. This was released to the public. Hey, that's me. All right, so another thing that Google had was this cool little app. You take a picture of yourself, and it would find a piece of artwork that looked like you, Google Art. So I took a picture, and it showed me this dude. And I thought, this has got to be a bug. So I pulled out the stats and got the data. I was ready to get my bug bounty. And then I looked at the photo again, and I am in that picture, according to Google. I'm the chair. My face is carved into it. Yeah. That got removed, by the way. Okay, because, you know, my buddy Kyle, thanks. This is a picture from Joss Wang was showing that her camera is racist. It said, hey, this picture is taken, but someone doesn't have their eyes open in this picture, right? And this was, again, this is in hardware that went out and is sold to like millions of people. So how does this happen? If you talk to developers, you talk to these companies, they'll be like, there was no malice. We didn't mean that. It's not our fault. But actually, by omitting people of color from the sample data, you create these problems. When you have a developer team that has no people of color in it, this is what happens. They would have spotted this 1 second into hitting run or executing that code, right? Normalization of whiteness by making it the default is what creates these problems, right? A face is a face. It's not a white face. It's not a black face, right? But too much of our tech is centered in whiteness, and that's what creates this problem. Okay. Technology is a double-edged sword. It can give you nuclear power, and you can run a city for pennies, or it can give you nuclear weapons, and you could turn a city into ashes. And this is the crux of it. Every time someone tells you about an amazing piece of technology, you have to remember there's an equally amazing, horrible thing inside of it. And if we don't train ourselves to think this way, we are going to end up in a bad future. Technology is a double-edged sword, and we're told that a smart city is a snow globe of utopian awesomeness, right? You ever see a smart city, and it always has an icon that looks kind of like smart city, you know? It's blue for some reason, and it fits into a snow globe literally. There's like a little smart train always. There's always a smart train, right? Why is that? So whenever I see this picture, I'm like, okay, if there's a dome around the smart city, who lives outside the dome? Maybe that's a place for me and people who look like me. There's examples in our modern world of amazing places, huge cities that are bustling, but right outside, people living in extreme poverty. But if you follow the money, that poverty fuels the city. Whether it's children in the Philippines diving for gold, getting paid not what that gold is worth, so we can buy it, right? Or children in African nations digging for pieces of diamonds. In this earth is value, and it is those other people, the suspicious others, the marginalized, who have to derive the value so it can be fueled and other small group of people can live in a lap of luxury. So here's a smart bench, right? Even a bench could be smart. Your chair is not smart right now, but it could be, right? This bench is powered by the sun. It fuels itself. It has a little battery in there. You can charge up your phones on it. It'll have a million sensors. It'll tell you the time, what time the bus is coming. It's wonderful. It makes you want to throw out all your benches. And if you were a city, yeah, they would come to you and they'd say, we're going to give you this bench at cost, like below cost. You know, we're going to subsidize this bench for you, city. You know, don't you worry, city. We're going to innovate. You're going to be high tech. Cities have like a little bit of a self-esteem problem. They all want to be innovators. And they're going to capitalize on that. And wow, how nice of this company to even sometimes give us smart tech for free. They're like, hey, city, it's on us. But if you look inside of that offer, you will see that money is what fuels this. And inside that device, it is digging deep into that earth and deriving gold and diamonds of data. The data is raw, but when that data is refined, it can be capitalized in ways you would not believe. How do we know this? Well, I have a Facebook account. You have a Facebook account? Right? You didn't do a data detox yet? You're still doing Facebook? It's okay. No shame. How much do you pay for Facebook? $0. Why do you pay $0? Because it's free. They want to give you this. They want you to connect with your friends. That's what Mark told me. Well, an intern at Facebook, do you know how much they make? Intern? $7,000 a month. I don't know how much you make, but I'm just saying. It's not bad, right? Software engineer, entry level, 126. You think you're making 6K? No, you're way over that, right? So it makes you think, you know, how much is Facebook making that they can offer this to, honestly, children, right? Like, this is right out of school, right? You know? You know? Okay. Facebook has data centers all around the world, tons of machines. That's what Facebook actually looks like. I know you think Facebook looks like that thing on your monitor. This is what Facebook looks like, right? Data centers where they have deals with cities who are begging and lining up to have one built. So they can have half of the people, the town folk, work there as security, emptying the trash, keeping the computers happy and cool, right? The power cost of these cities is 30-something million per data center estimated, right? I don't know how much your power is, but that's a lot. And that's just one data center. But that doesn't put a dent in Facebook. Facebook's still able to operate and make tons of money, always in the black. When you put a picture up on Facebook, if you use this plugin that'll show you what Facebook is doing to it, or if you're a nerd, you can view the source code, and you'll see these alt tags. As soon as you put a picture up, it's like, this is sky, cloud, car, outdoor, right? This is two people standing, sky, mountain, tree, outdoor, nature, right? Everything's immediately categorized. And guess what, Instagrammers? It's happening to you too. Your data, as soon as you provide it, is being mined and valued, and money's being created. And Facebook, they're like not giving you the change, right? So it's not like you're like, hey, here's my data, and we have some kind of honest brokering here. No, they take it all, they make all that money off of it, they give you nothing. Facebook can turn a 2D picture into a 3D picture. They can take one picture of you and create a 3D picture of you, allowing them to find your face from any angle in any lighting. Okay. You could find the value of a Facebook user on this site used to be. Okay. I'm going to move faster because I want to do Q&A. I want to do a lot of those electronic questions. I like that, voting up those electronic questions. Bring it, okay? Okay, so Cambridge Analytica, that whole scandal, which a lot of people don't really fully understand, proves that even Facebook can be duped. And this data that they're stealing from you and giving you nothing for, but giving you turning into lots of money on their end, which to me, that seems like theft, right? To me, right? If I took something from you, you gave me a blazer and I went to Buffalo Exchange in a hipster neighborhood and I got $1 million for that blazer and I knew it was worth $1 million, that to me is wrong, right? If I'm on the subway and I buy a comic book off of someone for 50 cents, but I know it's a rare original worth millions, that doesn't seem right. Cambridge Analytica tricked Facebook and took a copy of all that data on all of you. And that's how we found out about these shadow profiles. Not only does Facebook have a profile that you gave them, but it makes a profile for other people around you that don't have Facebook accounts. Facebook has a little electronic version of you, a little Westworld version of you living on their box, right? And they can feed ads to it and see how it reacts before it can run that ad on you. Free and liberate virtual you. Delete your Facebook account. I know no one's going to do that now. The phones, no phones came up, right? Okay. So what does it have to do with smart cities? Well, there's this thing called Sidewalk Labs, which is right here in New York City. That's where this company is founded. And Sidewalk Labs is reimagining cities to improve the quality of life. Thank you, Sidewalk Labs. So in Toronto, up north in Canada, there's a city. And it's a major city, and it's awesome. And it's like, I go there all the time. It's kind of like a mix between New York and San Francisco. But that city has a little bit of a self-esteem problem. People don't really treat Toronto like a great city. And they have a waterfront on the east side, and there's not much going on there. So the Toronto Waterfront Group, they're like a nonprofit, and they were working for years to revitalize that. And they made a deal with Sidewalk Labs. They said, listen, if anybody wants to bid to make this a nice little area here, do something here. And some real estate investors bid, and the kind of business people bid on that with their ideas. But Sidewalk Labs came in, and they had the winning bid. They wanted to create a mini city, like a small Toronto, run by Google, which is, run by Alphabet. Sorry, okay, so, because Alphabet is not Google, okay? Okay, so run by Alphabet. And Sidewalk Labs would build on that front a city like no other, powered by data. They would have people living there. You would have a structure that was built off-site and just kind of plopped down. And that structure has walls that could be moved. You could turn a one-family place into a two-family place, into a studio, into a business by just sliding things around. A city of the future run by Google. And Sidewalk Labs has all these other pieces of it, many companies that it's spinning off and creating. You might see these kiosks in New York, right? Link NYC, for this company called Intersection, which came from Sidewalk Labs, and things like that, okay? Some of the ideas they had for this new amazing city inside Toronto is a giant sidewalk, right? Like I live in Harlem, I've lived there for almost 2 decades. We have giant sidewalks. People, if you go up in the summertime playing dominoes, maybe even grilling some barbecue, whatever you want to do. So they want to do that, and how do you create the giant sidewalk? You remove the street. You take over half the street. Where will you park, you might ask? Well, let me tell you about this Google City in Toronto. It would have no cars. No cars are allowed in this zone. How do people get around? Through amazing bike paths and through these like trolley cars and self-driving cars, which they call automated vehicles, or the cuter term AVs, because self-driving car sounds creepy. It's an AV, right? On the bottom picture there is a little older stick figure woman walking across the crosswalk. But that traffic light is not a normal traffic light. It is a reactive light. It can see that there's a person there. And it will know that this is a woman walking and she's slow, and not let anyone drive until she gets across the side of the street, like a good Boy Scout. But when I see that, I see a piece of technology that can see people and can sense movement and can tell you who's going where, and can talk to all the other traffic lights about where this person's moving and where they're going, because a lot of people realize that smart cities are surveillance cities. Okay. The Human Project is something run out of NYU, also here in New York, and they're looking for a few brave women and men, right? Or gender nonconforming folks. These folks 10,000 of them who live in New York will give up all of their data, everything they do, everywhere they go, everything they eat, every person they talk to, even their medical information, for 20 years. Why? Why would you do that? Because it's science for science sake, really. They say like, well, I read in one of their materials, Galileo didn't know what he would see when he pointed his telescope at the sky, right? So if we just collect the data, we'll find magic in there. We might find planets in there, right? Okay? Yeah. You know, smart cities and the technology behind them cost a lot of money. And the team of urbanists and technologists that they bring are all-stars. And let me tell you, the lawyers, they're really big all-stars, right? And they cost almost nothing because the data that you create is going to turn into products and diamonds, but not for surveillance. It's not the worst thing. It's to sell to other cities, and especially the city that it's in. When Google collects information on traffic patterns and who's living where and how people move, that is not open data for us all to use. That's data for them to mine and turn into products. And how easy do you understand the point of pain of a group when you're monitoring them under a microscope and then marketing and creating the perfect thing for them to buy at the price that you know they could just afford? When you're a city, that could be your IT, it could be your infrastructure, it could be everything. Because this is a gamble, but they don't want to just be in that harbor. They want this part of Toronto to grow. Moving forward. So questions are our swords. Data is our shield. Don't lose your data. Don't give it away. And ask a lot of questions. I'm going to run through some stuff pretty quickly, but always ask what are the civil liberty and civil rights abuses that could come from this technology, because the people who developed this technology, they know it, okay? Can this technology be used by law enforcement to hurt the very people in my community that you're telling me that you're helping, right? Is this data worth anything? How much is it worth? And what is done with the profits? Can I get in on that? Until we start asking that, a smart city is going to be a smart exploitation of us. Okay. Okay, boom. Just going to move through here pretty quickly. This is just a thing from 2000 that TSA agents target black women more than anyone else. They were just searching them constantly, right? But it wasn't for any reason. It's just like an idea in people's heads. And this is like the bias that we have as human beings affects the way that we use everything, whether it's tech or security or safety. Here in New York City, we have this thing called omnipresence, where if you ever go to the hood, you'll see these petrol-generating canisters that shoot lamps. They fuel light, blowing light into first-floor windows of public housing. Now I just see blankets, like stapled, gunned, and taped on people's windows, because these things are so loud and so bright. The idea was crime happens in darkness. So if we blast light all day, there'll be no crime. But if you check, the people of Norway will tell you that's not true, right? Okay. Okay. These are my pictures of what these things look like, right? In some neighborhoods, omnipresence looks like basically a mini police presence with a mini portable police offices around the entire neighborhood. Right? If you don't walk through one of these neighborhoods, you'll never see this. There's gang conspiracy charges, which are things that are pretty easy to loop someone into. So by association, you get looped into this charge. If you know someone who committed a crime, you can be pulled in as someone who might have been a part of a gang that conspired to commit this crime. And this is how whole areas of our city are people are being removed. Young folks wake up to their doors being kicked in, and then by the lot, they're pulled out and charges are brought on them. There's one of my neighbors, Jelani Henry, who's a friend of mine. He was in Rikers for 18 months on a gang conspiracy charge, waiting for his day in court before he was just let go. They just opened up the cage and said, here, you're free now, right? No explanation, no sorry. This is what it looks like. It's in conjunction usually with like federal forces, almost like you're testing stuff out because you don't need an infrared helicopter and FBI agents and armored vehicles to pull out a couple of dudes who are sleeping. Okay. We have monitoring of social media, which makes me not trust the tech people out there, right? Companies like Geophedia and Dataminer, who originally were funded by groups like Twitter, et cetera, right? And had special access to data. They can comb through vast amounts of data quickly. There's not one person looking at a Twitter feed, right? They can say, who was that person that said F Trump? Not like anyone would say that in this room, but who was that person? Who was the first person to say that in this city? And then who retweets that stuff? Who is organizing these folks? All of that can be found in a matter of milliseconds because of these companies and their technology. Cool. Let's kind of move forward. I want to get to questions. OK, so every piece of tech that we use has a front door for law enforcement. For Facebook, if you went to facebook.com/records, that's the front door for law enforcement there. Any security force in the world, you put in your email address, and you're given a link where you can say, I want to request data on that user. That data is not stuff that you are sharing on your public wall. It's any data you've created, the data you can download. It might even be a chat that you're having with just one of your friends. OK, let's move forward. Boom. On Google, there's this thing called LURS. It's the exact same thing. Law enforcement request system, lurs.google.com, front door, access. The thing is about these sites, it is access for law enforcement, access for prosecution, but not access for defense attorneys, not access for you. I'm going to move past nuisance abatement. Boom. Of course, we've seen CCTV cameras. There's these things that are skywatch towers, which are also in certain neighborhoods. I'm imagining that in our smart city, we see things that we want to see. Avocado toast on every corner, right? But outside our smart city, we have a heavily surveilled city. This is my neighborhood. We have these skywatch towers. It's a police booth on robot legs, right? And right over there to the left, we have an electronic mini police car to replace those little patrol boxes that you see, right? ShotSpotter is a technology that can track the trajectory of bullets by listening to the speed of sound. Looks like that, if you ever see these things on telephone posts, et cetera. I'm just going to move forward. Just some information about how it doesn't actually work, because people don't fire guns and then stand in one place, right? Okay. In Baltimore, there's a company that was flying a plane in a circle, just taping downward at the inhabitants of the city, right? Especially in black and brown neighborhoods, giving a 24/7 live view of what's going on, surveilling those areas. It seems like something out of Parable of the Sower or some sci-fi, but it's yesterday's news, right? This company, Persistent Surveillance Solutions, or System, sorry, is the one that came up with that, which is someone who's like, look, I like the way drones worked when I was working in the military. And I thought, could I make a cheaper drone with a plane and a high-resolution camera? And that's what this company basically does. We know that, and if you go to the workshop that I'm in, cheap plug, sorry, it's coming up after this. There's a predictive sentencing and predicting policing that's done with technology, right? With the predictive sentencing, it says to a judge, you should give this much time to this person because our algorithm has said they will be a repeat offender, or looking at their past, or even who their family is or who their family members were, you should sentence them harshly or leniently, right? And with predictive policing, it says these neighborhoods need police forces there versus these other ones, criminalizing people by their latitude and longitude. And then there's e-carceration, where in a smart city, the person to your left or right might actually be in prison, sentenced to time, even charged for the equipment that they're forced to carry. A curfew tells them when to go home, tells them how long to stay in their home. They are actually living a life in prison, right? Technology has tried to give us these kind of like video phones for prisons, where a person who's in prison can talk to their family. But prisons are now charging the families huge amounts of money to even use these services and replacing in-person visits. This is a piece of information about here in New York City, we had these data analysts who feed our CompStat data. And some officers were cooking the books just small amounts of data, just making small changes because it's kind of like a baseball card. But it's not a baseball card. You change a small number in one place, and you completely change how the algorithm works. And you completely change the stats. And a lot of this information is based on, if not racist data, manipulated, badly created garbage data. It's garbage in, garbage out. OK, so here's how to contact me. I think I have some time for questions. No, I don't. I tried. OK. Well, I would say this in closing. Right? There's nothing smart about a smart city, except for its cool name. We already have cities, and those cities have problems. And you cannot solve social problems with tech solutions. That's not how it works. OK, thank you.
So it was such an amazing talk, and there was so much to go over. So I really look forward to your workshop this afternoon in W400. So go and ask all of your questions to Matt and the team there. Also, it was brought to my attention that my introduction before this sounded a little bit othering, very much us and them. That was not my intention. I want to make sure everyone knows that in this community, we're inclusive, in the civic tech community. And it was definitely in the anxiety of public speaking and trying to move on that it came out like that. So I just really want to acknowledge that and thank whoever brought it to my attention, because that is exactly how improvement happens in our community. So thank you. So next up, and I'm sad that we didn't get to ask Matt questions because I really wanted to sit on the cool chairs with him, Ricardo Alfaro. Ricardo reached out to us and told us he had come to PDF about 10 years ago and got inspired by the culture and community of civic tech. Ricardo is formerly the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs and Technology for Puerto Rico, and he came back to the US to work in the Beltway. But when Hurricane Maria hit the island and left it more or less isolated, Ricardo found himself wanting to help in the way that he could, getting folks connected. So according to that recent Harvard study, it found that 4,600 people died in the aftermath of that hurricane. Our government really, really failed. So it's folks like Ricardo that are getting people on the island and getting them connected, and that's a first step, but we need to do more. But Ricardo is going to come up and tell us about what he did in that project. So please help me welcoming Ricardo Alfaro to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, and at this point, good afternoon. I'm thrilled to be here at PDF. I'm an alumni, so thank you very much, and part of my involvement has been precisely because of attending these conferences. So I'm originally from Puerto Rico, where I grew up. And Puerto Rico, as most of you may know, was hit by what is classified officially as a Category 4 storm on September 20th, 2017. And please bear in mind the category, as this, I'll come back to this point at the end of these slides. The result of the hurricane was that left the island entirely dark. There is absolutely no cell towers, no power, and no way to get in or out of the island. And I didn't hear back from my family for nearly 2 weeks. And it was truly hell. And I wanted to do something. I reached out to other tech brigades, but we realized that we all had in common the same problem. There was no data coming out of Puerto Rico. So with over 95% of cell towers out of service, we can truly conclude that Puerto Rico went entirely offline. So how do you coordinate? This presented additional logistical challenges in terms of how do you get resources down to the island. So I knew that a few nonprofits and additional people were getting bottled waters and canned foods down there, but how do you get them to the island when it's entirely offline? And more often, if you're able to get those supplies to the island, how can you deploy them to the communities that need it the most? So I kept watching as other entities tried to deploy experimental technologies. The problem was that no one was explaining to the people that these were experimental technologies. So you had an issue of quality of service where people expected these technologies to work as they normally would, which created a lot of frustration. So I came up with this crowdfunding campaign and did a little bit of research, and after a while found this Garmin device, and basically this was the setup that I came up with to make it self-sustaining, solar-powered, so that people can just send a text message, which was really, coming back to my initial point, just a text message would have been suffice on those first weeks to get to know a little bit more about my family and how they were. After I had the setup, I went down on October 24th, 34 days after Hurricane Maria made landfall. And I had no idea what to expect down there. But this is what I found. A lot of cables still on the ground, with over 83% of cell towers still unavailable in Barranquitas. It was entirely full disconnected. Roads have been washed away along with roads. But here's another interesting fact that I found out when I went down to Barranquitas, which were these tarps. These tarps had been set up by FEMA to address the citizens' claims. There's only one problem with this approach. You just saw a slide where the roads and the houses had been washed away, so people couldn't get to these places. And more of these places were connected by vehicles like this one, which was, as they dubbed it, an Oasis provider. So I sat down there, basically with a rogue team of friends. I myself as an electrical engineer, Javier, a computer engineer, Ruth, a computer science, and Pablo, a land surveyor, and we teamed up with a local parish of volunteers who see that in the middle, that they were already delivering foods and supplies to the sick, elderly, and people in bed rest. We managed to connect over half the town of Barranquitas by deploying a very simple, straight, out-of-the-shelf product where we would have the volunteers running around with technologies, which I happen to have on me right now, and we would have them just deployed and covering the whole area, getting supplies back, getting information back to a centralized point, and then relaying that via satellite. So additional nonprofits, we teamed up with additional nonprofits, and the photos speak for themselves in terms of how people felt empowered. This is pretty much how the map looked like at the end of our journey. But a few challenges to think about as I'm wrapping up here. First off is relying on frail infrastructure. The infrastructure was already frail before getting down there. There was a lot of government bureaucracy, and within all the experimentation, a lot of what was going on, they forgot about the people. So a few opportunities here to think about. First of all, keep it simple. These were off-the-shelf products, pretty much. Training was at minimum. Network with your peers. If it had not been by conferences like this one and by the good relationships that I had with people still on the ground, this would not have been possible. And focus on empowering the communities, which is where the actual people live at. And they know their communities very well. And I'll leave you with these final slides of how Puerto Rico looks like last week, pretty much. So there is no denying that Puerto Rico is still not ready at all to face another storm. And recall the category that I mentioned at the beginning. So this was what was left of the weather radar that they're still rebuilding. And it was designed to withstand a Category 4 storm. So clearly, maybe that Category 4 is still somewhat debatable. And I recognized that my project was basically to fill a void of what would have been expected of the official disaster response should have been. When it comes down to it, we're talking about human lives. Staying alive, it's not about experimentation. It's about thinking clearly and keeping it simple. It's about empowering communities and using our networks. So let's keep it simple and let's make good. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you for reminding us that the situation in Puerto Rico is still dire, and these are fellow Americans who we're talking about. So our last two talks are really going to sew up a lot of the themes and questions, I think, that we've been raising both today and yesterday. And I think you'll also see that they also work in tandem with each other. The first one, it's a privilege. We've been already signaling how excited we were to be able to bring Samid Chakrabarti from Facebook, where he is a director of product management, in charge of all the things that Facebook is doing that have to do with civic engagement and voting and politics. And he's been there for several years, where his initial focus was civic, and now I think in the wake of a lot of the controversies of the last year, as you'll hear, he and his team and several other members of his team are here, are engaged in trying to solve a lot of the problems that people have been talking about. And so we're really, really glad to have him here. I'm looking forward to engaging with him in the Q&A, and as you all know, there will be a workshop this afternoon where you'll have a chance to go deeper with Samid and his team on these very questions. Samid Chakrabarti. All right.
Well, as Mika mentioned, I'm Samid Chakrabarti, and I lead our civic engagement product team at Facebook. And today I'm just going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of how we're thinking about improving civic discourse on Facebook and the challenges associated with it. But I actually just want to start by thanking Mika and Andrew for inviting me to speak today, because I've actually spent my whole career working in civic tech. I've been PDF many times in the audience, and they're a large part of why I got into the field in the first place. Because back in 2004, they wrote a manifesto that literally changed my life, and here it is. They wrote, "A new force built on and around the internet is rising. The cost of finding like-minded souls, banding together and speaking to the powerful has dropped to almost zero, and that networked voices are reviving the civic conversation. Personal democracy, where everyone is a full participant, is coming." They wrote this in 2004, 14 years ago. And this is what inspired me, and I think it's probably what inspired all of you to get into this in the first place. And it's this bold vision that actually ultimately led me to Facebook 3 years ago, because I knew that Facebook could end up being a critical part of the civic infrastructure. But we have to remember that even though Facebook is an intimate part of people's civic life these days, it wasn't always obvious that this is the role that it was going to play. So back in 2004, the Facebook, as it was then known, was just an online directory that connected people at colleges. Really nothing more, nothing less than that. And it was never originally designed for civic discourse. But connection is a really powerful thing. And soon people started to use it to talk about politics, to organize, and to do all kinds of other civic activities. And by 2011, when Facebook was playing a critical role in things like the Arab Spring, we all heralded it as this sort of technology for liberation. And we all thought of social media as a technology that could connect us to the public sphere, that it could inform us, that it could challenge us by seeing new points of view, that it could mobilize us to take civic action and ultimately empower us as citizens, especially those of us who may have been more marginalized by society's gatekeepers. But now let's skip forward to present times, when 2 billion people are channeling their energy into a platform that was never designed for civic engagement. And the platform is being stretched in really unexpected, unanticipated, and emergent ways. And I think its shortcomings have become abundantly clear to us all, whether we're talking about misinformation, echo chambers, or foreign interference in elections. And I think this is causing all of us to now question the fundamental premise, not just of social media, but of our whole civic tech movement. And that is, can a more connected world be a more civic world? This is a deep question that's caused us at Facebook to have a broader sense of responsibility than we've ever had before. And we know we need to not just amplify the positive elements of civic discourse on the platform, but also prevent the abuse of the platform from being amplified. And I'm well aware that many of you in this room may be very skeptical and may no longer believe, if you ever did, that social media can be a force for good in the world. And so I actually just wanted to share with you like an insider's view of how we're trying to tackle these problems and show you why I think through more civic-centric design, we can make good on the promise of social media. And so let's start by defining what exactly is healthy civic discourse. Well, rather than decide on our own, we often ask our community what they think through a combination of focus groups and in-context surveys, like you see here. And what we found is that all around the world, people are actually remarkably consistent, and they want the same thing. And that word "same" is actually a convenient acronym for the types of things that people are asking for in their civic discourse. So they want safety, authenticity, meaningfulness, and effectiveness. So safety meaning they want conversations to be civil, not offensive, or filled with hate speech. They want authenticity. They want real people and real information behind the conversations. And they want the conversations to be meaningful. They want conversations that encourage and build their sense of community and not those that divide. And then they want the conversations to be effective. They want them to have real impact on public policy and other dimensions of civic life. So to illustrate how we're thinking through each of these challenges, I'm just going to go through 4 quick case studies, one in each area. And let's start with safety, where really one of the most vexing problems is how can we prevent online speech from inciting real-world violence. So as Kenya readied for its election last year in August, there were widespread fears that election-related violence could erupt, just like it did in their 2007 election, where tens of thousands of people died. So we were concerned that politically motivated hate speech on our platform could erupt into real-world violence. So to be clear, hate speech and credible threats of violence have no place on Facebook. They're a violation of our community standards, and we remove them when they're reported to us. And traditionally, we've thought of people on Facebook as being our best eyes and ears for finding these kinds of problems. And it's always been pretty easy for people to report any piece of content, like you see here, for violating our community standards. And we get on the order of 1 million of these reports every day, and we try to process them all. So historically, this seemed like a pretty good approach to trying to find content problems on the platform. But as the election approached, we started seeing a 4x increase in Kenyans reporting this kind of harmful content. And given just how highly charged the election environment was, we wondered whether we'd actually be able to remove this kind of content quickly enough. And so we knew we needed to take a different approach than Facebook has traditionally in order to protect against this potential kind of harm. And thanks to advancements in AI, we were able to try out more proactive reporting. So rather than waiting reactively for people to flag things for us, we tried to remove harmful content before people had reported it. So here's how it worked. So we did this by training machine learning classifiers to look for Kenya-specific political slurs. The AI system then proactively flagged suspect content, and then we passed those reports along to a country-specific team of people who would manually review them before taking them down. And you know, this approach allowed us to move a lot more quickly, efficiently, and cover a lot more content, and it ended up being 60% more accurate than reports submitted by people. And this is the kind of technique that we use in elections all over the world to protect against a wide range of potential harms proactively. And I think it represents a really significant change of posture in how we think about civic safety on Facebook. So let's go to authenticity next. So here, the key problem is, like, how do you make sure that the people who are involved in civic conversations really are who they say they are? And this is particularly important because who says something is often just as important as what they're saying. So as you all know, in 2016, the election in the US showed the real dangers of this kind of inauthentic civic content. And we at Facebook were too slow to really realize what was happening on our platform, but we've been trying to make up for lost time. And we're constantly improving. So we now stop 1 million fake accounts every day at the point of registration, most of which are bots. But I want to talk about an even tougher problem than bots, and that's how do you stop inauthentic accounts that are run by real people? And so the approach that we're taking to this is actually one of transparency. So we believe it's really important to know who's behind the political content that people see. And this is especially true of ads, where this is often how bad actors build up their audiences in the first place. So that's why we're taking the extraordinary step this year of verifying the identities of all political advertisers on Facebook, starting with the US. So that means that unverified advertisers who try running political ads will have their ads blocked. And we use a level of identity verification that's sort of similar to when you open up a bank account. So we ask for a government photo ID, last 4 digits of social security number, and then we send you a letter in the mail to your physical address to ensure that you are where you say you are. And then we're also making all political ads available for 7 years in a searchable archive. And we realize we have an opportunity here to bring a new level of accountability to the political ecosystem. And that's why the archive actually shows the full ad creative of all the different versions of an ad, the amount spent, and demographic information about the ad's audience. And you know, when we started piloting ad transparency more generally in Canada earlier this year, advertisers told us that it was kind of changing the way that they think about their political messaging, because they now knew that the whole world would see the full picture of the messages that they're putting out there. And you know, I believe that that's a good thing, and I hope that researchers, journalists, and other watchdog groups make good use of this kind of system. And if you haven't actually played with the ad archive, you can go try it out, and I encourage you to do it because I think you'll find it really fascinating. So let's move to meaningfulness next. So people want civic conversations that build their sense of community and that don't divide. And Facebook's mission is literally to bring the world closer together, so we share this goal. And that means not amplifying polarization. So the causes of polarization are really complicated, including a fragmented media environment, economic inequality plays a role, and a lot more. But we feel a sense of responsibility to do our part to make sure that we don't make this problem worse. So one feature that we tested in this area was called Perspectives. So this product makes it really easy for people to compare the platforms of different political parties around election time. And it was our hope that this could help alleviate some of the echo chambers and give people more empathy for other points of view. But how do you actually know if features like this have any real impact on polarization? Well, we've been investing really heavily in research to try to measure polarization so that one day we may be able to answer questions like this and to evaluate their impact. Because if we can't measure it, we'll never really know. So one behavioral metric that we use for polarization that we've been developing is something that we call preferential interactions. So it attempts to measure how much more likely people are to like posts from friends who share similar news preferences as those who engage with dissimilar news. So the idea being that in a polarized world, people form closer bonds with people that they agree with. So by looking at whether people are interacting more with people that they agree with, maybe we can start to measure polarization, maybe even in real time. And it's really early days here, and we have a lot more research to do to validate this kind of approach. But I think it shows how computational social science and innovations in that field are going to be really critical to us being able to understand these problems in more depth. So I actually see this as a first step towards civic health metrics for tech products. So my dream is that all product teams at Facebook will one day have a dashboard that doesn't just let them see how people are interacting with their products and how many people are interacting with their products, but also see how their products are impacting the quality of civic conversations as well. So I hope that we can get there. Let's move on to effectiveness now. So in particular, how can digital interactions with politicians be more effective? So it turns out that millions of people are interacting with their representatives on Facebook, but relatively few of them actually get a response. And this is pretty sad because getting a response lets you know that you've been heard. And it's more indicative that you may have influenced policy. So, you know, we conducted many focus groups with politicians over the years to find out why aren't they responding much when people contact them. And what we found out is that they told us that they don't actually believe that the people contacting them are their constituents. So we thought, what if we let people opt in to showing that they live in a politician's district? Will that drive more replies? So we call this feature a constituent badge. And it allows people to put a special icon by their name when they comment on their own representative's posts. It's right there. So we started rolling this out in the US last year, and we were trying to figure out if it actually worked. So here's what we found. So unfortunately, there was no effect on politician reply rates, which is disappointing. However, amongst constituents, something remarkable was happening. So there were more repeat interactions. So when somebody claimed the badge, they would actually interact with their representative more than they would before. that there were more civil and substantive comments when people claimed a badge. And there was more participation from women. And this is really important because we've previously shared that women are underrepresented when it comes to public political discourse on Facebook. And so features like this actually help to correct that kind of imbalance. And so that was a huge moment, in my career when I saw for the first time that civic-centric design can actually impact and create greater civic outcomes at a really broad scale. But none of this is quite as easy as I've made it sound, and we know we have a long way to go in this journey, and that civic discourse on Facebook is really far from where we need it to be, where we all need it to be. And there are a lot of problems that we haven't even started to make a dent in yet, and even more that we don't even really understand. And pulling off this kind of work is really challenging. So a lot of people ask me if Facebook's commercial motives are what makes this kind of work hard, whether what's good for the business actually undermines what's good for people. So I just wanted to say that in my experience, that has never been the case. In all the product reviews I've done with Mark and other execs, I've never been asked to choose between these goals. We've never been told, for example, to sacrifice people's safety in order to chase a profit. Because we all know that in the long term, if we don't do what's good for people, we won't even have a business. So I want to actually talk about what makes it even more difficult. And that's really what makes it especially challenging is when the values that people have actually conflict with each other, when values conflict with other values. And so I just want to give you a few examples of this based upon the product examples that I already just went through. So some people may see efforts like our constituent badges as promoting more equitable engagement. But others may see it as attempts for social engineering that actually artificially skew natural discourse. Some people may see our efforts to depolarize, such as the Perspectives Unit, as laudable. But others may think that they cross the line into paternalism over people's media diets. And some people applaud our transparency efforts as ways of creating more authenticity and a more genuine conversation. But others worry that a lack of anonymity could actually threaten vulnerable groups who need secrecy in order to avoid persecution. And many people call on us to do a lot more about safety, to keep people safe on our platform, while others worry that this actually just amounts to censorship and actually undermines freedom of speech. And I believe actually all of these points have merit. And we don't pretend to know actually what the answer is in all these cases. And these dilemmas are not straightforward. So to give you a sense of how tough this can be, let's do a thought experiment together on this particular issue of safety versus censorship. So imagine an election is coming up and you have a technology that can proactively catch a lot more violence-inducing hate speech than just listening for reports. So you have two choices here. You can optimize for safety and deploy the system and proactively remove them, or B, you kind of worry about being a source of interference potentially yourself, and so you do nothing proactively and you only remove stuff reactively once it's been reported. So I want to do a show of hands. Who would choose A?
Who decides what gets removed automatically and proactively?
We'll get into one level of detail. We're going to do a multi-step process here, but I want everybody to make a decision here when we vote, because you need to commit. Not taking an action is also a deliberate choice as well, and you're ultimately responsible. So raise your hand if you want to do A. Now raise your hand if you want to do B. Okay, there's already disagreement here, right? Now, what if I told you that the proactive system is 98% accurate, and it catches 10 times more harmful content? Who would choose A? And who would choose B? Okay. Now what if I told you that those 2% of errors actually took down posts from one political party 3 times more often than they did the others? So you actually might be disproportionately harming innocent posts that are coming from this party's supporters. but it's only 2% of the time. Who would choose A? And who would choose B? And several of you have stopped voting. That's interesting. OK. We haven't even actually talked about, like, how would you figure out what somebody's political party is while still respecting their privacy? So there are more questions that are embedded in here. I want you to raise your hand if you actually switched your vote at some point during this exercise. OK. So all of you guys actually have a pretty good idea of, like, why my hair is gray. You know, this was a fictitious example. But we have to balance concerns like these every day as we strive to improve our platform. And we know we aren't always going to get it right because, you know, problems like this have actually been debated by philosophers since the beginning of civilization. And so that's why we need your help. You know, we can't do this ourselves, and I'd even say we shouldn't do it ourselves. So if you actually like discussing hard questions like this and helping us work through it, please come to our workshop this afternoon, where my colleagues Crystal and Katie will tackle a lot of these questions in a lot more depth in the context of election integrity. And we really welcome your thoughts. So in closing, let me just acknowledge that this has been a tough couple of years, and not just for Facebook, but I think for all of us who believe that technology can empower the voiceless. We're basically reckoning with the fact that this optimistic vision of personal democracy that we've had is at risk. And that's, I think, really deeply uncomfortable for all of us in this room. But the answer can't be to retreat from this vision and to try to de-democratize. We shouldn't be making it harder for people to connect. We shouldn't be making it harder for people to share their voice. Because without social media, a lot of movements like Me Too may never happen. And so rather than dwell on the downsides, we need to fix them. And I hope you see what I've shown you today as, like, real evidence that this is possible. That it's possible to catch harm before it's too late. That it's possible to change incentives through transparency. That it's possible to make intractable problems measurable. And that it's possible to give people a greater sense of permission to speak. So I really want all of you guys to stay hopeful, because we need you. We really need you on this journey, because I think only together can we make a more connected world, a more civic world too. So thank you.
Take a seat quickly. I got 2 minutes for questions, because you went a little over, but I wanted to try and get 1 or 2 audience questions in. And I just want to say, we've actually deprecated that manifesto. We took it out of the program this year, and not because the ideas weren't noble, but because I don't think we thought that that these platforms could be weaponized in the way that they've been weaponized, and that's what our next speaker is going to be talking about. And so the question I was going to ask you is, to what degree are you worrying not just about individuals who maybe have extreme points of view, but that state actors have decided to, in effect, invade our space, right? Or invade the, that there are malicious forces that are much bigger than just the individual, the collective effects of lots of disparate individuals. How much is that on your mind as you try and think about what do we do to try and ameliorate this?
With the foreign actor problem specifically? Yeah. I mean, it's top of mind, yeah. Actually, in many ways. It's actually one of many issues. Like, I think we covered a whole range of issues, and this is just a subset of the issues that we think about. And when you talk about elections in particular, the mix of problems that you see is really different depending on which country an election is taking place. So I think in places like the US, where the foreign interference problem is relatively a large problem relative to other countries, it's one we think about a lot more.
Okay. And so I'm going to go very quick to get one of these in. Do you think that, in addition to the things that you just described, could Facebook consider, like, really rethinking its mission and deciding to slow its growth? For example, don't make it so easy for everybody to connect to everybody else. Really limit the scale of people's friend groups to, like, just the 150 people who are, like, intimately, closely in their actual community. Is that even conceivable? Because it seems like Facebook won this competition to scale up to 2.2 billion, and that's so fundamental to its success that something like that couldn't be conceived.
Well, yes, I think everything is on the table. And all of these things need to be like considered with their pros and cons associated with them and so forth. And I think Facebook actually did change its formal mission about a year ago, a little over a year ago, to recognize that connection on its own wasn't enough. That actually just the term connection is too value neutral for a mission to be. And so that's why we've moved beyond merely thinking about connection to thinking more about like how do we make sure that people we can bring people closer together through connection. And so I think we did rethink our mission, tried to have a more explicit statement of values around it, and like drastic changes to the platform are definitely possible, can be considered, and the pros and cons of them need to be debated.
Great. Well, we're looking forward to getting into that conversation this afternoon with you at your workshop. Folks, bring your questions there and get into it with Samid and the rest of the team here from Facebook. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Here. This is Renee. Okay. Now, introducing our last speaker for the day, Renee DiResta. So I first came across Renee just in this last year. I mean, she has been working as Director of Research at New Knowledge and Head of Policy for a new group called Data for Democracy. But behind the scenes, Renee has been, I think, a force of nature in helping all sorts of people in media and in Congress and in the regulatory agencies start to get their heads around just how serious the collection of factors that we're dealing with, just how badly democracy is being disrupted and distorted. And with her talk, what we are hoping she will do is bring it home in helping us understand just the complexity of the challenge and really what we all have to do more if we're actually going to face up to it. Renee DiResta. Do you need a hand?
No.
Okay.
I broke my foot a couple days ago, and I think I'm actually okay, but I'm going to leave this here just in case, because sometimes it goes to sleep. Thank you. I know I'm the last thing between you and lunch, so I'm going to give a talk, try to do a rapid-fire kind of summary of what's happened over the last couple of years. I've been a disinformation, now it's called disinformation research. It didn't have a name a couple of years ago, and we'll actually kind of go into why that was a bit of a problem. So I'm going to start by saying something glaringly obvious. Something is wrong on the internet. And it's actually, so much is wrong on the internet that now it has its entire lexicon, right? So we have misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, fake news, filter bubbles. And rather than giving a list of definitions, some of you probably understand a little bit of the nuance in those terms, I actually want to walk through a couple of examples. Because I think that the kind of showing will help you see what you might be seeing as well. So during the evaluation of what Russia was doing, I was one of the researchers looking for the content from platform to platform, looking at the kind of spread of the content, where it appeared, when it appeared. This was, of course, prior to the tech platforms acknowledging that this was a problem. So this was all work that we were doing in 2017. So one of the things I did one night was we had this, information was trickling out in dribs and drabs. There were a bunch of independent researchers who were sharing information in Slack channels and Twitter groups. The fact that a page called Muslim Voice had been one of the Internet Research Agency pages came out, and so I started looking for the content for Muslim Voice. So I found this cache of content on Pinterest one night, and I happened to be logged in my real account. It really just sort of like a random collection of clicking on things. I find myself on this Pinterest board. It is clearly it looks like a repository of this content. It's just entirely posts, memes from the Instagram account Muslim Voice. So I say, oh, that's interesting. I click around a little bit more, discover that there's also content from the LGBT page. They had a number, hundreds of different pages. One of them was a pro-LGBT page. So this one Pinterest account had Muslim Voice, pro-LGBT, okay, likely a Russian account. Log it, archive it, send it to the New York Times. So I get a call from the reporter the next day saying, hey, we want to talk a little bit more about some of the stuff that you found. Okay, fine. So I was on vacation with my kids. I was at Disneyland, which is why there's a switch from web to mobile here. And I pull up Pinterest, and I'm like going back to find the stuff that I was looking at the other night, and I realize my entire feed has transformed. literally 2 hours, this is what I start to see. So I've got Russian language craft projects over there. And over here, I've got Dinesh D'Souza videos. Now, I'd been on Pinterest for about 6 years. I planned my wedding on Pinterest. I planned my kid's first birthday on Pinterest. I have an Instant Pot. I have so many recipes on Pinterest. But that does not, pumpkins, it was around Halloween time, I guess. But that doesn't matter because 1 hour of looking at the content and all of a sudden, collaborative filtering kicks in, right? Collaborative filtering is the recommendation engine algorithm by which the platform decides that you're not going to see just the content you looked at, the type of content you looked at. You're going to see things that people who also looked at that content looked at. So not I looked at these Islamic memes, ergo I'm going to get more Islamic memes. No, it's I looked at these Islamic memes, ergo I'm going to get the content that the other people who looked at these memes also looked at, which is where we get the Russian trolls who likely put it up, and then the extremists on the right wing that it was targeted at. Case study number 1. Number 2, I did a lot of the work on the ISIS stuff for State Department through U.S. Digital Service. We were looking at how to counter-propagandize, how to think about counter-messaging, how to think about the fact that ISIS was building up a virtual caliphate, and the tech companies were remarkably unconcerned about this whole thing for several years. Again, the same kind of thing. You would watch one YouTube video. You would be taken down this path. I think Zeynep Tufekci called it the radicalization engine. That's how we came to think of it a couple years prior. So again, the type of content that we see, this has grave consequences, not just for individuals, but for society as well. So let's walk through how this came to be, and let's start back in Web 1.0, where we all had our GeoCities pages or our Blogger accounts. We could all write whatever we wanted. Zero-cost publishing, the idea that we're democratizing ideas and we're giving people the power to say whatever they want. This is, this was kind of one of the great promises of the internet, that it was no longer just these kind of storied institutions that had access to speech and to getting a message out, but that anyone could do it. So, of course, if anyone can publish anything, then surely misinformation has existed forever, and that's, of course, true, and it existed, on my GeoCities page likely as well, right? But then we get to Web 2.0, where we have the rise of social. So this is the early aughts. And so we have one after another, we have these tech platforms that begin to emerge, and what we start to see happen there is the experience is better when they amass large audiences, and so it almost kind of self-selects, where these gigantic standing audiences are in one place. So we no longer have this decentralized sporadic content. Instead, we have people largely kind of communicating both with the people that they know in real life on Facebook and then getting yelled at by complete strangers on Twitter. But you have the situation where there are these amassed standing audiences. So the network effects create this entrenchment of power in a new information ecosystem. What happens next? All of a sudden, all of these people are on all of these platforms, which means that timeline-based feed no longer works. So reverse chronological order is deprecated, and instead we get algorithmic amplification, where the types of recommendation engines that I was showing you, the content-based filtering, the collaborative filtering, all of the tools for presenting information to people in a way to keep them engaged, to keep them on the platform. This is where we get algorithmic amplification, and we start to see the emergence of trending. Stories that, obviously you want to see what's trending, you want to see what your friends are talking about. We see search, right? SEO gamification becomes a huge business for a while until Google kind of gets its hands around that. And then we see the recommendation systems. So the kind of 3 curatorial functions, search, trending, recommendation, they appear kind of across the web nearly simultaneously. What happens? Well, at this point, we see popularity begin to outrank truth, and that's because since these are engagement-driven algorithms, what they're looking for is what do people engage with? Well, people engage with things that they like, or they engage with things that are sensational, or they engage with things that make them feel a certain way. So you look at this, I did some work on the anti-vaccine movement over years, and you look at what the CDC puts out, which is this very staid, like, it's unclear to us the extent to which XYZ has happened, versus the kind of extremist rhetoric that you see on the other side, which is much more emotionally resonant content. And so you begin to see this interesting situation where the things that are popular really begin to, they hit all of the notes necessary to trigger the virality engines that keep this content proliferating. So of course, who realizes this really early? Conspiratorial communities and people who traditionally didn't really have access to mainstream ways to spread this kind of candidly nonsense. And so we begin to see this rise, and yes, everybody's democratized, everybody has a voice, but there's this asymmetry of passion where nobody in this room gets up and tweets about how the earth is round and vaccines don't cause autism and Pizzagate really was never a thing. So this creates this interesting situation where a lot of the content that's created is created by conspiratorial communities, which means that when you search for key terms, we have this interesting phenomenon of what we call news voids or keyword voids, where you're much more likely to see the content created by the group for the message, even if the message is extreme or conspiratorial, because the regular kind of mainstream news sources don't catch up. Incels is probably the most recent example of this. What happens next? Well, at the same time, we have the ads interface that we were just hearing about. So we have this remarkable ability to target. So now you not only have the everybody in one place, everybody saying what they want, algorithms amplifying the most popular or sensational messages, but we can also make sure that we can target people. So if we do want to grow more niche audiences, we can reach out and we can target them with ads. And they're all, again, on the platforms. So I've been saying this, I think I've had this slide since 2013. The power to influence opinions increasingly lies with those who can most widely and effectively disseminate a message. That's because everything is a marketing campaign now. And so here's the slide that everyone was like, I can't believe you're putting this up at PDF, but who realizes this really, really early on? DARPA does in 2012. So this is the thing that is almost never talked about, which is actually, whenever you hear the government was not on this, no, that's not true. The government was on it back in 2012. And so DARPA had this program called Social Media and Strategic Communication, SMISC. It's all open source. The archives are out there. You can go read it. This was things like the Twitter Bot Detection Challenge. Imagine that, a bot detection challenge being run on Twitter in 2013, 2014. So these are the kinds of things. The program description, through the program, DARPA seeks to develop tools to help identify misinformation or deception campaigns to counter them with truthful information, reducing adversaries' abilities to manipulate events. So what was the popular reception to SMISC? Well, everybody hated it. The government was interfering in the free and open web, and how could we possibly want Uncle Sam monitoring social network communications? Because, as we've heard, there are some terrible things that can come out of that. But then on the flip side, this is the kind of program that was prescient and that understood what was happening in the information warfare space long before, literally years before, we could impress upon the platforms the need to do something about it. So now we hit the present day where we have this system that's evolved over the last 10 years to facilitate democratized propaganda, and that military and defense did realize was being used to facilitate weaponized narratives. So that's where we are today. We have misinformation and broken recommendation systems that aren't just ubiquitous, they're actually commodified. So because why did it take so long to get us to the point where we have the tech platforms as willing partners and trying to find a solution? Well, that's because, again, likes, clicks, engagement, all of this drives ads, and when you have that social network ecosystem where all of the people are, they're all attention brokers, which means they all compete with each other, so there is deep incentive let's talk about Twitter. Let's use Twitter as an example here. When 9 to 15% of the users on Twitter are bots, but Twitter's stock price is dependent on its monthly average user numbers, does Twitter go in and aggressively take out the bots? Well, for a long time, the answer was no. So there we go. So again, we had the rise of conspiratorial communities. We saw this stuff happening early and often with them. Then we had ISIS, which literally built a virtual caliphate across the social media ecosystem, and we did nothing. And we did nothing for years. The EFF wrote helpful talks about how one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and if we took down ISIS content, what on earth would that mean for free speech on the internet? So this is where we see that absolutism really kind of coming back to bite us in the ass. Then we look at Russia, which did the exact same playbook that the conspiracists and then ISIS did, but they did it covertly. And so instead of being brazen and building a brand as ISIS did, they just ran the same playbook, but they did it covertly. And so we've begun to see some of this trickling out. More and more is going to continue to come out. These were pages that had hundreds of thousands of followers. This is not small, and we keep hearing about ads, ads, ads. Ads is one vehicle to amass a large audience. The thing that we are not talking about is groups. If you want to go and you want to reach a standing audience, why on earth would you pay for it when you can just go and co-opt an existing community? And this is where we start to get at the idea that it's not as easy as keyword detection. It's really much more of an information security problem that requires more of a cybersecurity type solution with things like red teaming and pen testing, and thinking more in the way that DARPA and other information security agencies do, where they realize that a full understanding of what's going on in these communities is absolutely critical to understanding how this is going to continue to evolve. Because dealing with ads is fighting the last war. And we have elections coming up, and candidly, we don't really seem to be in much further along than we were a couple years ago. So no one is coming. It is up to us. That's because really still nobody is in charge, because we have the regulators that don't fully understand what they're regulating. We have a couple of different avenues for regulation that I think we're going to talk about in my afternoon session. We have the platforms that, to their credit, are beginning to take this much more seriously than they had in the past, but it's not quite there yet. We have civil society. We had April Glazer is going to be in my session also, and she had a great quote with regard to civil society. So organizations like Cato, the ACLU, and the EFF, who were really vehemently against some of the DARPA programs, actually, saying the people most equipped to propose a way to regulate large internet platforms and then fight for it have been jarringly quiet. And that's because we actually aren't seeing that same kind of level of civic pressure. We do see it kind of targeted at government and government overreach. We don't really see it coming out as much, recognizing the kind of shades of gray or the areas where private businesses need to be dealt with in a little bit more aggressively, maybe. So, it's not all doom and gloom. On the government front, Mr. Zuckerberg did just show up in front of Congress and in front of the EU. Inside the tech companies, we do have interesting projects. Google's Project Redirect is one that I really like a lot, where they are looking at how can we take that recommendation engine and begin to recognize signatures of radicalization and maybe send people in a different direction. We're starting to see whistleblowers coming out. The Center for Humane Tech is really kind of attracting the attention of a lot of ex-tech people who want to talk about solutions, including most notably some like Guillaume Cheslow, who wrote some great pieces recently about the YouTube recommendation engine in particular and how to think about radicalization on the platform where most of our kids and teenagers are spending their time. So we have to be talking about how we translate our values into industry norms. These attacks have a profound impact on democracy, which is dependent on an informed electorate and allowing for mass manipulation operations and the unchecked rise of conspiracy theorists, which, to the point made earlier, it's not just bots. That really is very, very true. It's not just bots at all. And that's where we get at the really hard questions, which is how do we think about things like do not recommend? What do we allow to stay on the platform and be discoverable perhaps through search, but the platforms don't proactively suggest it? How do we think about radicalization via recommendation engines? How do we answer these questions when the only people who really understand what's going on in terms of those radicalization mechanisms are the platforms, because only they have the data about when someone watches this video, what do they go do next? So these are the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about in my session, and I'm happy to turn it over to questions now.
We'll take a few questions. Yeah. Thank you. Here, can you sit or lean?
I'll lean.
Here, we can lean. We can lean. Thank you so much. So questions. The first one that's right there. Can you talk a bit more about big tech, how big tech has created more mistrust of the government control of the internet? I think you alluded to that a little bit, the sort of, pushing back on government trying to take more of a proactive approach to these problems.
It's interesting because we're at the 5-year mark, I think, in the Snowden revelations, and I would bet, my opinion of that is different than a lot of people's, but. I think we haven't ever really recovered from that, right? We don't have tech working particularly well with the government, partially because of the stuff that went on there, partially because tech doesn't want to be seen as a pawn of the U.S. government. These are multinational companies, and so, of course, they don't want to be seen as doing the bidding of USG. I was in the room during some of the conversations where we were trying to deal with the ISIS thing, and they had air cover from civil society, so there was not very much pressure to inspire anyone to take action back in 2014 and early 2015 when we started to see these things happen. Because there really was a sense that government shouldn't be telling the platforms how to police speech or how to police content, that they had their own kind of First Amendment right to decide how to moderate accordingly, but simultaneously they were being told that moderation was censorship. And so until we get away from the idea that moderation is censorship, I think it's a really difficult to see a path forward there.
Right. What about the role of elected officials here? I mean, do you know, watching those hearings recently, apart from the tech executives trying to avoid or, giving answers that were incomplete answers, you saw a lot of politicians who clearly didn't have their heads around this either. I mean, is there anybody or any way that we can get some of the people who, in theory, have oversight power?
Yeah, so I did a lot of those briefings. You can see that it's kind of varying degrees of sophistication. I can talk a little bit about that, I think. So back in September, myself, Tristan Harris, and Roger McNamee went down to DC and said, it'd be really great to convene hearings because the Russia thing was kind of an ongoing battle. This was at the time before we were still hearing things from Facebook like it was only $100,000 worth of ads. That really riled up a lot of independent researchers who were like, no, we're tracking this all over the internet. This is millions and millions of engagements. And so we went down to DC and said, wouldn't it be great to have hearings so that also we felt that it was really becoming politicized. Russia was becoming this this politically divisive issue, and we were saying, people need to understand what happened, and a bipartisan hearing would be a great way to get past that. I wrote personally 55 pages worth of briefing docs on literally Internet 101. It was this is an ad roll. This is how YouTube monetizes. This is a click. This is a click-through rate. This is this is engagement. This is likes. This is organic content. This is virality. Made a ton of these briefing docs. And for the first hearing, I got to say there were some staffers who were incredible. So the the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in particular, just truly remarkable in their sophistication around the issue and their ability to educate their other colleagues. That's not true throughout Congress. That, as I learned later, that was not the norm. That was the exception. So I think as far as how to solve it, there's groups of us who are kind of researchers in places like Data for Democracy, where we have just people contributing in Slack channel, just drop in, drop out, talking about things that they're seeing that merit further attention. We have people who write op-eds. We have people who go to DC and brief.
It came up earlier, and I think also maybe I heard you on a podcast with Mike Masnick talking about this, that most of the actual watchdogging work that's being done is being done by volunteers.
That's very true, yeah.
And journalists, to some degree journalists as well, right? Who
yes.
get paid a little more than volunteers. But that the infrastructure, the civic infrastructure to form some pressure, it's not coming from the advocacy organizations to date.
No, it's not. So a lot of the complaints that we hear from congressional staffers actually are the only people who come to brief them are big tech, which has the lobbyists, the telecoms, which of course are kind of an adversarial relationship with big tech. And then they periodically get things from civil society, but oftentimes they feel that that's just kind of anti-tech. So they're not hearing, one of the reasons that Center for Humane Tech, that Tristan started that, or that we started Data for Democracy, was the idea that there was an opportunity to create nonpartisan or bipartisan recommendations. And I've sat down with Senator Graham's team and others. We do go and meet with Republicans regularly, actually, to try to make sure that the realization is that this is not a partisan issue and that it does need bipartisan consensus, and we need to come to a shared solution about what the internet is going to look like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot more to talk about, and thank you for getting our appetite for the conversation a little...
Go eat.
Yes, and we're going to take everybody into lunch now, but thank you, Renee. Room 301 in the afternoon to join her workshop. Andrew,
Perfect.
Take us to lunch.
So just a quick reminder, so Negin Farsad is going to be here at 4 o'clock on a more lighter note, which will be sort of telegraphed by the video you're going to see on the way out the door. So enjoy lunch, but please be back in your seats. We're going to give away another prize at 4, and enjoy the workshops. We'll see you later.
Thanks for coming, Mr. Zuckerberg. How are you?
Just a sec. Mom, could you get me my Frodo ring? I want it here.
Okay, now that we got the ring sorted out, we can move on to the topic at hand, which is the concerns that have been raised. Need water, okay. Now, as I was saying, there's been a lot of concern about people's private information in-house.